A 10-year-old girl was abandoned barefoot in a Montana blizzard. No boots, no coat, just a piece of stale bread and blood left in the snow with every step she took. The people she trusted called her dead weight and walked away. But she didn't die. She was found by the most powerful man in the valley, a hardened widower who had lost everything and no longer believed in much of anything. That one decision, made in a blizzard on a frozen road, didn't just save one child. It started something that would change hundreds of lives across the frontier for decades to come. Stay with this story until the end, and hit like, then drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The storm didn't announce itself. That was the thing about Montana in February. The sky could be pale and still at noon, and by 3 o'clock it was a wall of white noise that swallowed everything whole. Trees disappeared. Fence lines disappeared. The road south out of Harlan Creek disappeared so completely that a person standing on it wouldn't know they were standing on anything at all. Eliza Hale was 10 years old, and she had been walking for 2 hours. She didn't know exactly how long. She'd lost the ability to feel her feet somewhere in the first 40 minutes, and after that, time stopped meaning much. What she knew was the cold. The particular murderous cold of a Montana blizzard that didn't feel like cold at all after a while. It felt like burning. Like her skin had been replaced with something thin and wrong, something that wasn't keeping her inside herself anymore. She was barefoot. That wasn't an accident. Her boots had been taken 3 days ago by the older boy Marcus, who said his need was greater and that she should be grateful he hadn't taken her coat too. She hadn't argued. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Marcus ended with her eating less for a week. The piece of bread in her left hand was stale enough to use as a weapon. She'd been rationing it, 2 small bites every hour, she'd told herself, though she had no reliable way of measuring hours. She'd eaten 4 bites total, or maybe 5. She wasn't certain anymore. What she was certain of, she was going to die out here. The thought arrived without drama, the way practical thoughts do. She was 10 years old, and she understood death the way children who've lived the life she'd lived understood it, not as something distant and abstract, but as a regular visitor. She'd watched a baby die in the orphanage in Billings when she was 6. She'd watched a man freeze to death in a doorway in Helena when she was 8. Death was not a stranger, still. She kept walking. There wasn't a reason exactly. It wasn't hope. She'd been pretty well cured of hope by then. It was something more stubborn than hope. Something her body did without asking her permission, putting one destroyed foot in front of the other, leaving small red prints in the snow that the wind erased almost immediately. She fell twice. The second time she stayed down for a moment, just a moment, with her cheek against the snow, and she thought, this is where it ends. Not with anger, not with fear anymore, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. Then she thought about Marcus's face when he'd taken her boots, the smug certainty that she was nothing, less than nothing. Dead weight, he'd said. That's all you've ever been, Eliza. Dead weight. She got up. Gideon Mercer had been riding the south fence line since before the storm turned serious, and any reasonable man would have turned back an hour ago. He knew that. His horse, a thick-chested roan named Cutter, had been telling him so in the eloquent language of horses, ears pinned back, gait increasingly reluctant, a periodic full-body shudder that communicated professional displeasure. I know, Gideon said. We're heading back. But he didn't head back immediately. He sat on Cutter at the crest of a low rise, pulling his coat tighter against the wind, scanning the white nothing below him with the automatic vigilance of a man who'd lost things to bad weather before and hadn't fully recovered from it. He was 53 years old. His wife, Caroline, had been dead for 11 years. His son, Thomas, had been dead for 6. The ranch, 12,000 acres of some of the best grazing land in Cassidy Valley, was his, and only his, and on days like this it felt less like a possession and more like a sentence. He was about to turn Cutter around when he saw it, a shape in the snow, small, wrong, not the shape of a rock or a downed post or any of the things his eyes had learned to categorize automatically, a human shape, too small. He was down off Cutter and moving before the thought had fully completed itself. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, or rather, she felt them, a vibration through the frozen ground that reached her through the snow and her ruined feet and traveled up her legs. She'd been walking again, or thought she had been, though she wasn't sure her feet were actually clearing the ground anymore. When he crouched in front of her, she flinched. That was her first instinct before everything else. Flinch. Pull back. Make herself smaller. She'd been doing it so long it was automatic. "Hey!" His voice was rough. Not unkind, exactly, but rough. The way all men's voices sounded when they weren't used to speaking gently. "Hey, look at me." She looked at him. He was big. Not tall exactly, but solid in a way that meant something out here. The kind of solid that comes from decades of physical work. His face was weathered to leather, and his beard had gone gray, and there were lines around his eyes that suggested either a man who squinted into the sun a lot, or a man who'd done considerable grieving, possibly both. He was looking at her feet. She watched his jaw tighten. That was the only movement, just the muscle in his jaw going hard for a moment before his face settled back into something carefully neutral. "Can you understand me?" he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out wrong, thin and far away, like someone speaking through several walls. "What's your name?" She almost didn't answer. Names led to questions, and questions led to people finding out who she was and where she was from and who was responsible for her. And in her experience, the people who claimed responsibility for Eliza Hale were not people she wanted located. But she was also fairly sure she was dying, and lying required more energy than she had. "Eliza," she said. Eliza. He said it the way people say a name when they're not going to forget it. "Okay, Eliza, I'm going to pick you up now. Don't fight me." "I don't." She stopped, swallowed. "I don't fight people." Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. "Good. That's going to change, probably, but right now it's useful." He lifted her like she weighed nothing, which she supposed she did. She'd been underfed for 2 years, and her 10-year-old body was a collection of sharp angles and hollow spaces. He carried her to his horse, and the horse stood still for him, with the practiced patience of an animal that trusted its person completely. "I'm going to set you across the saddle," he said. "You might fall asleep. Don't." "I won't." "You sure?" "I don't sleep easy," she said. That was true. Hadn't been able to sleep easily in years. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was unreadable. Not pity, she didn't think, though she braced for pity, and then he nodded once, like something had been confirmed. "All right," he said. "Hold on." The Mercer ranch house was not what she expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something cold, maybe. Matching the man. Instead, the house was enormous and warm, heated by 2 large fireplaces that she could feel from 20 feet away when he carried her through the front door, and the smell hit her like a physical thing, wood smoke and something cooking, something that involved meat and onions, and the sudden violence of that smell against her empty stomach made her dizzy. A woman appeared, older, in mid-60s maybe, with a sharp face and the build of someone who'd spent a lifetime doing hard work without complaint. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and then she saw Eliza and stopped. "Her feet," he said. The woman, she was the cook and housekeeper, Eliza would learn, named Ruth Carey, crossed the room in 3 strides and bent down to look at Eliza's feet without touching them, with the focused attention of someone who knows what they're looking at. "How long?" she asked. "Don't know," he said. "I know what she needs. I'll get the water. You stay with her." Ruth looked at Eliza with the direct, unsentimental gaze of someone who has no patience for pretense, but also no cruelty in them. "Can you talk?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Good. That's good. I need you to stay awake for me." Everyone keeps saying that. Something moved in Ruth's face. Not a smile, not quite, but the thing that lives next door to a smile. "You're going to be all right," she said. "You don't know that," Eliza said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. "You're right," she said. "I don't know that, but Mr. Mercer found you, and he doesn't let things die on him if he can help it. That counts for something." Stop. The next 4 days were pain. She'd expected it to hurt when feeling came back to her feet. She wasn't naive, but the reality of it was different from the expectation. It was a specific kind of burning that existed at a frequency she hadn't known was available, and it arrived in waves, and there were times in those first 2 days where she cried without being able to stop herself, which she hated. Gideon Mercer came to check on her twice a day. He didn't say much. He'd stand in the doorway of the small room they'd put her in. It had a real bed with a real mattress, which she hadn't slept in since she was 4 years old and her mother was still alive. And he'd look at her feet, which Ruth was tending with considerable expertise, and then he'd look at her face. "Anything you need?" he'd ask. "No," she'd say. "You eaten?" "Ruth brings food." "You ate it?" "Some." On the third day, she asked him, "Why did you bring me here?" He was in the doorway, his usual position. His hands were in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the floor rather than at her, which she'd started to understand was how he looked at things when he was thinking carefully. "What do you mean?" he said. "You could have taken me to town. There's a doctor in Harlan Creek. You could have left me there and been done with it." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I could have." "So why didn't you?" He looked at her then, directly, which wasn't as rare as she might have thought. He was a man who looked at things directly when he decided to. "Because I didn't want to," he said. Is that a sufficient answer? It wasn't really, but she didn't push it. She was still calculating. That was how she survived, always calculating, assessing threats and exits, and the relative safety of any given situation. The man was rich and powerful, and lived alone and had brought a strange child into his house. Those were facts that required examination. But he didn't hover. He didn't watch her with the particular hungry attention that she'd learned to recognize and fear. He kept a distance that she gradually realized wasn't coldness, but was something more like respect, an acknowledgement that she was a person with a right to space. On the fourth day, when the pain had subsided enough for her to sit up properly, Ruth brought her breakfast and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "He lost a son." Eliza looked at her. 6 years ago, Ruth said. "Thomas. He was 14. Fever took him. Nothing anyone could do about it. Before that, there was Mrs. Mercer. 11 years ago." She paused. "I'm not telling you so you feel sorry for him. I'm telling you so you understand that he's not a man who does things without a reason. He brought you here because he chose to. And Gideon Mercer doesn't make choices careless." Eliza ate her breakfast. Real eggs, real butter, the kind of food she'd forgotten existed, and thought about that. She'd been at the ranch for 2 weeks when she asked him if she could help. He was at the kitchen table with ledgers spread out in front of him, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and he looked up when she came in, still moving carefully, her feet wrapped but moving, and said, "Help with what?" "Anything," she said. "I don't like sitting." "Your feet are better," Ruth said so. He looked at her for a moment. She'd noticed that he did that. Took a moment before responding to things. Not because he was slow, but because he was deliberate. He'd been deliberate his whole life, she'd later understand. It was the thing that had kept him alive through 40 years of Montana ranching. "You know anything about cattle?" he asked. "No." "Horses?" "Not really." "Can you count?" "Yes." "Can you read?" "Yes." That was one of the things her mother had done for her before she died, taught her to read. It was the best gift she'd ever received, and the thing she was most grateful for, even when gratitude was hard to come by. He nodded. "Then you can help me with these." He gestured at the ledgers. "I'm not bad with numbers, but I'm slow. You'd be faster." She sat down across from him without being invited, which was either bold or rude, and she wasn't sure which, and looked at the ledgers. They were cattle accounts, inventory, costs, projected weights, market prices. The numbers were clear enough. "This column doesn't add up," she said. He leaned over to look. His eyebrow went up. "You're right," he said. "It's not a big error. $4.30. It's still an error." He picked up a pen and corrected it. "You've got a good eye." She didn't say thank you. She wasn't ready for compliments yet. They felt dangerous, like they came with expectations attached. She just looked at the next column. They worked together for 2 hours. He didn't talk much while he worked, which suited her. She wasn't much for talking either. March came, and with it a rider from the east, a county man named Potts, who came to the door on a gray Tuesday morning with an official manner and bad news, wearing a better suit than it deserved. "There's a situation," he told Gideon, standing in the entry hall while Ruth looked on from the kitchen doorway with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was her business. "Over in the Clearwater Pass area, a family, the Drapers, Took sick. Both parents didn't make it. Left 3 children. How old? Gideon said. Oldest is 9, youngest is 4. Gideon was quiet. Potts shifted his weight. He had the manner of a man delivering information he knew was going to create inconvenience and was preemptively defensive about it. The county doesn't have a facility. The nearest orphanage is Billings, but the road— I know what the road to Billings is like in March, Gideon said. I'm not asking you to take them permanent, Potts said quickly. Just for the winter, until the pass opens up and we can— Send them, Gideon said. Eliza, who had been listening from the hallway— she listened from hallways now, when possible. It was a habit. Watched the county man's face cycle through relief and something else, something like surprise that it had been that easy. I'll need to document— Send them, Gideon said again. And send me the documentation. I'll have it in order before you need it. After Potts left, Gideon stood in the entry hall for a moment. He didn't see her at first. When he did, he didn't look surprised. You heard all that, he said. Yes. And? She thought about it carefully. 3 more, she said. Where are you going to put them? East Wing has rooms, hasn't been used in years. They'll need— She stopped herself. She'd been about to say they'll need someone who knows what it's like, and she wasn't ready to offer that yet. What? He said. She looked at him. They'll be scared, she said. I know. You don't— She chose her words. You're not a scary man, but you're a big, strange man, and they won't know that yet. It helps to have someone their size tell them it's all right. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you volunteering? She hadn't planned to, but standing there in the hallway with the morning light coming through the window and the smell of Ruth's coffee in the air, she said, Yes. The Draper children arrived 4 days later. Their names were Henry, Clara, and Willa. Henry was 9. Close enough to Eliza's age that she knew immediately he'd be the hardest to reach, because 9-year-old boys who've lost both parents don't want comfort. They want someone to tell them they're still in charge of something. Clara was 7 and seemed to have gone mostly inside herself, speaking only when directly addressed and looking at everything with large, watchful eyes. Willa was 4 and had been crying since she arrived and showed no signs of stopping. Gideon handled it the way Eliza was starting to understand he handled everything, directly, without performance. He crouched down to their level in the entry hall, which was something she hadn't expected from him, and said, My name is Gideon. This is my house. You're going to stay here for a while. Nobody's going to hurt you here. Henry looked at him with the particular skepticism of a 9-year-old who's been promised things by adults before. How do we know that? Henry said. Gideon looked at him steadily. You don't, he said. Not yet. I guess you'll have to watch and see. Eliza stepped forward then, from where she'd been standing back, still unsure of herself in this role she'd taken on, and said to Henry, I've been here a month. He means what he says. Henry looked at her. You an orphan too? Yes. And he just took you in? He found me in a blizzard, she said. I was barefoot, and I probably had 20 minutes left, so yes, he just took me in. Henry looked at Gideon again. Whatever arithmetic he was doing in his head came to a provisional answer. He reached down and took Willa's hand, which was the clearest signal he knew how to give. Okay, he said. Spring came slowly to Cassidy Valley, the way it always did in Montana, grudgingly in fits and starts, with April snowfalls that felt like a personal insult after the promise of March. But it came. By the time the wildflowers started pushing through on the south-facing slopes in May, the ranch had changed. Not dramatically. Gideon was not a dramatic man, and he didn't run a dramatic operation, but in the small, accumulating ways that matter more than dramatic changes do. Henry had attached himself to the barn with fierce single-mindedness, and Gideon had assigned him actual responsibilities there, which was exactly the right thing to do. Henry needed to be useful. He needed to matter. Gideon saw that without being told, and it made Eliza revise upward again her estimate of the man. Clara had found Ruth, or Ruth had found Clara. The exact direction of that connection was hard to trace, but they were frequently in the kitchen together, Ruth teaching Clara the particular mathematics of bread making, and Clara had started talking again, not much, but consistently, which was progress. Willa had attached herself to Eliza with the absolute, unquestioning devotion that 4-year-olds give to people who make them feel safe. This was simultaneously the most precious and most terrifying thing that had ever happened to Eliza. She was 10 years old. She did not know how to be someone's safe person. She was still, in many ways, figuring out how to be her own. She told Gideon this one evening, said it bluntly, the way she'd started talking to him, because she'd realized he preferred bluntness to diplomacy. And so did she. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "With Willa." They were on the porch. The light was going gold and long across the pasture, and the cattle were moving toward the water trough in that unhurried end-of-day way they had. "Nobody does," he said. "That's not helpful." "No," he agreed. "It's not. What I mean is, nobody knows what they're doing with children. You do the best you can with what you've got. You pay attention. You adjust." "What if I get it wrong?" "You will get it wrong," he said. "So will I. So does everyone." He looked out at the pasture. Getting it wrong and keeping going anyway is what the job is. She thought about that. "Is that what you did? With Thomas?" She said it carefully, because it was delicate ground and she knew it. She'd never said the name before. Ruth had told her, but she hadn't used it. He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I got it wrong with Thomas in ways that still sit bad with me, and I can't fix it now." A pause. "What I can do is not make the same mistakes twice." The light finished its slow transformation, and the pasture went blue, and the cattle settled, and somewhere in the barn Henry was singing something off-key to the horses. "Okay," Eliza said. "Okay," he said. They sat there until it was dark. The summer brought more children, not in a flood, nothing so dramatic. But word moved through frontier communities the way it always does, through riders and storekeepers, and people who carry news the same way they carry everything else, as practical cargo. A rancher south of the valley whose wife had died, leaving 4 children and no arrangement. A boy of 7 found wandering outside Harlan Creek, nobody claiming him. A pair of sisters, 14 and 12, who'd been traveling with a wagon train that had broken apart badly outside of Billings, their parents among those who hadn't made it. Each time Gideon sent for whoever needed sending for, or rode out himself when the roads allowed it. Eliza watched him do it. She also helped him do it. By midsummer, the East Wing was full. She helped him convert part of the equipment shed into additional sleeping space. Simple but solid, with proper beds and windows and a small stove. Nothing grand, but nothing insufficient either. She and Henry did most of the actual work, with Gideon directing and doing the parts that required real strength. "You're good at organizing," Gideon told her one afternoon, watching her direct Henry and 2 of the older children in moving furniture, with a natural authority she didn't seem to notice she was exerting. "I'm just telling them what needs doing," she said. "That is what organizing is," he said. She frowned at the room, mentally measuring. "We need another window. The ventilation is poor. I'll have it put in." "The south wall." He looked at the wall. "Agreed." She turned to look at him. "You always listen to me," she said. It wasn't a complaint, more an observation, still being processed. "You're usually right," he said. "Lots of people are right and don't get listened to." He looked at her levelly. "Yes," he said. "They do. What would you like me to do about that? Stop listening to you?" She almost smiled. That was still rare, even in summer. "No." "Then we agree," he said, and went to find his tools. There was a boy who arrived in August named Daniel Cole, and he was trouble in a way that the others weren't. He was 11, older than Eliza by a year, which he made sure she knew, and he had the hard-edged wariness of a child who'd been passed from household to household and learned that the best defense was to make himself difficult. He stole food, even though there was plenty of food, because plenty of food was a temporary condition, and you had to plan for when it stopped. He lied reflexively. He started fights with Henry for reasons that made sense only inside a particular, damaged logic that Eliza recognized because she'd had version of it herself. He also had a habit of disappearing at night. Eliza found out about this because she didn't sleep well, and she heard him the third night, the careful creak of floorboards, the soft click of the back door. She followed him. He went to the barn. He sat in the hayloft with his knees pulled to his chest and stared out the small square window at the dark pasture and the stars. And he didn't cry, She could see his face clearly enough in the moonlight to know that, but there was something in his expression that she understood without needing to name it. She climbed up to the loft. He heard her coming and his whole body went tense. "I'm not telling Mercer," she said, sitting down a few feet from him. "I don't care if you do." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not going to." He looked at her sidelong. "What do you want?" "Nothing." "People always want something." She thought about arguing with that and decided not to. "Are you trying to figure out where the horses are?" she said. "What?" "If you needed to leave fast, are you counting the horses, figuring out which one you could take?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "The gray," she said. "Second stall from the left. She's the easiest, and she's fast enough." A pause. "I figured it out in the first week. I didn't use the information." "Why not?" She looked at the stars. "Because I decided to stay," she said. "That's different from having nowhere else to go." He didn't say anything for a long time. She didn't push it. "My last place," he said finally. "The man used to lock the food up, said it kept us from getting wasteful." "That's not what it was for," she said. "I know that now." "It's okay to be hungry here," she said. "I mean, it's okay to feel like you're going to be hungry. You don't have to steal because of the feeling. The feeling is just the feeling. The food's actually there." He looked at her with a complicated expression she couldn't entirely decode. Skepticism, partly. Something else underneath it. "You sound like you read that in a book," he said. "I didn't. I worked it out myself." She stood up. "You can stay up here if you want. I'm going back to sleep." "Hey," he said. She stopped. "The gray's actually the third stall," he said. "Second from the left is the bay. The bay's faster." She looked at him for a moment. "Good to know," she said. "Yeah." She was 11 years old when she finally asked Gideon about her family. Not the wagon she'd been traveling with. She'd told him that story early on, in bits and pieces, how she'd come to be with the Cole family, and then the Brennan family, and then the group of travelers who'd eventually abandoned her in the blizzard. She'd told him the facts. What she hadn't told him, and what she was finally ready to ask about, was whether there was anyone left. "My mother's name was Anna Hale," she said. They were in his study. She spent considerable time in his study now, helping with the accounts, which had expanded significantly as the ranch had effectively become something that required actual administrative management. "She died when I was 4. I don't know what happened to my father. He was gone before I can remember." He looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing. "I'm not asking you to find them," she said quickly. "I know, I'm not naive about what that means. I'm asking—" She stopped, organized her thoughts. "I want to know if there's anyone who should know where I am. Not to go back to, just to close the account. So nobody's looking." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "I'll make inquiries. It might come to nothing." "It might," he agreed. "And if it does, that's all right," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "I have a place here." He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to, and something moved through his expression that was too complex to name easily. "Yes," he said. "You do?" The inquiries conducted by a lawyer in Billings, who handled Gideon's legal affairs, came back 2 months later with the expected results. Anna Hale had died of fever when Eliza was 4. David Hale, her father, had abandoned the family well before that, and his whereabouts were unknown and likely unknowable. There was no other family on record. Eliza read the report at the kitchen table, and Ruth sat across from her the whole time without saying anything, which was the exactly right thing to do. "All right," Eliza said when she'd finished reading. "All right," Ruth said. She folded the report and set it on the table. "I want to help make dinner," she said. Ruth slid her an onion and a knife without comment. The winter of her second year was harder than the first and easier in every way that mattered. Harder. Because there were 11 children at the ranch now, and a Montana winter with 11 children was a complex logistical operation involving food and heat and medicine and the particular chaos of human beings of varying ages and temperaments being confined together for weeks at a time. Harder because Daniel got sick in December with something that settled in his chest and scared her in ways she hadn't been scared in a while. Harder because one of the newer arrivals, a girl of 8 named Bridget, had nightmares that woke the whole wing, and nobody had yet found the right combination of things to settle her. Easier because she knew now that it was going to be hard, and that hard didn't mean failing. Easier because she knew these children, their names and their specific fears, and the things that helped and the things that didn't. Easier because when Daniel was sick, she knew how to sit with him through the bad nights, and she knew what he needed to hear, which wasn't reassurance because reassurance felt false to him. What he needed to hear was that she'd been scared too, and it sucked. And they'd get through it. He did get through it. Easier, most of all, because she knew where she was. She knew this house, its sounds and its light, and the smell of it in different seasons. She knew Ruth's moods and Gideon's habits, and Cutter's preference for apples over carrots. She knew where everything was and how everything worked, and what to do when things went wrong. She was 11 years old, and she had a place in the world. It was the first time in her life that had been true. In January, Gideon told her something that he'd been carrying for a while. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, sitting at his desk with the lamplight going low and the wind off the mountains hitting the window in long, irregular gusts. He said, "I've been in touch with a lawyer about the formal arrangements." She looked up from the ledger. "If something were to happen to me," he said carefully, "the ranch should go somewhere useful. Not to distant cousins I haven't met. Not to the county." A pause. "I'd like to establish something formal that ensures what's being done here can continue." That's... She didn't finish the sentence. "You'd be too young to run it outright, but you're not too young to be named in the documents as the person it should eventually pass to, with appropriate trustees in the interim." She sat with that for a moment. The enormity of it. The weight of what he was trusting her with. Not just now, but going forward, into a future she couldn't see. "Why me?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because you already are running it," he said. "I just own the land." She looked down at the ledger, looked back up. "You're not going anywhere," she said. It came out a little rougher than she intended. "Not immediately," he agreed. "But I'm not a young man, Eliza. I'm just being sensible." "I don't like it," she said. "I know. I think you should—" She stopped. She was going to say she thought he should find someone else, someone older, someone more equipped for the responsibility of it. She almost said it. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'll look at the documents when your lawyer has them ready." He nodded. He understood what she'd almost said and hadn't, and he respected the not saying. That was something about him she'd learned too. He understood the shape of the conversations that didn't get had, and he held them carefully. Outside, the wind knocked against the window once, hard, and then settled. The lamp burned low between them, and she went back to the ledger, and he went back to whatever he'd been reading, and the house held all its people safe inside it against the winter dark. The lawyer's documents arrived in February, on a day when the snow was coming down in the particular lazy way it did when the temperature had actually risen slightly. Big, slow flakes that piled up fast and silently, the kind of snow that looked peaceful and was quietly treacherous. Gideon signed them at his desk with Eliza sitting across from him, and then the lawyer, a thin, precise man named Aldous Webb, who'd made the trip out from Harlan Creek in a rented sleigh, witnessed the signatures and packed everything into his leather case with the careful movements of a man who understood that the paper he was handling mattered. "You understand what this means," Webb said to Eliza directly, which was not something adults usually did. She was 11. Most adults addressed remarks about her to other adults in her presence, as though she were furniture that might have opinions. "It means the ranch continues," she said, "whatever happens." Webb looked at her for a moment over the edge of his case. Then he looked at Gideon. "She's right," he said. "She usually is," Gideon said. "That's why I'm doing it." After Webb left, they didn't talk about it. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. Eliza went back to the kitchen to help Ruth with the afternoon meal, and Gideon went out to check on the south pasture fence that had been giving trouble, and the snow kept coming down in its gentle, relentless way, and the ranch went on. That was the part that struck her sometimes, in quiet moments, how the ranch simply went on. Not because it was easy, but because the going on was the whole point. 11 children ate breakfast every morning and needed coats and arguments settled and fevers checked and multiplication tables drilled, and someone to tell them reliably that tomorrow is coming. The work of that didn't pause for documents or weather or feelings. She'd learned to be useful in the pauses. She'd learned that there weren't many. Spring announced itself that year through the mud. That was always how it happened in Montana. Not through warmth exactly, but through the frozen ground giving up and becoming something you sank into. The children hated the mud. Eliza put Clara in charge of boots, which meant Clara collected them at the door every evening and cleaned and dried them overnight, and this gave Clara something to be responsible for, which was what Clara needed. Clara was 8 now and had come considerably further out of herself, though she still went quiet in a particular way during thunderstorms that Eliza recognized and didn't push against. Henry had grown 3 inches over the winter and was now significantly taller than Eliza, which he mentioned with some frequency. He'd also become genuinely indispensable in the barn. Not just useful, but skilled, with a feel for horses that Gideon said was either natural talent or the result of spending more time with them than with people. Probably both, Henry said when Gideon told him this. People are harder. Yes, Gideon said, they are. Daniel had recovered from the chest illness and emerged from it with something that looked cautiously like trust. Not the broad, easy trust of children who hadn't been hurt. That was gone for him and wasn't coming back. And Eliza didn't mourn it exactly, because the trust that replaced it was sturdier. He trusted specific people based on specific evidence, and the evidence had accumulated over the winter, and now he trusted Eliza and Ruth and, with more reservation, Gideon. It was enough. He'd also turned out to be extraordinarily good at fixing things, not just willing to try, but actually talented, with a mechanical mind that saw how parts fit together and why they'd stopped fitting. Gideon had started leaving him the small machinery repairs with minimal supervision, which was either a sign of real confidence or the pragmatism of a man running a large operation with limited hands. Probably both, again. The children who'd arrived most recently were still finding their footing. There was a boy named Peter, 10 years old, who'd come from a mining camp north of the valley after both his parents had been killed in a collapse. He was still mostly silent, which Eliza didn't push. She remembered her own silence in the early weeks, the way she'd needed to watch before she could speak, to verify that the safety she was being offered was real before she could take it. She let Peter watch. She made sure there was always enough to watch, meaning enough small, ordinary goodnesses that the evidence added up on its own. There were 2 girls, Nora and Frances, 9 and 6, sisters who'd been found at a stagecoach relay station 2 days after the driver had died mid-route, and the other passengers had sorted themselves out without much consideration for the children in the mix. Frances cried frequently, at volume, which was healthy and normal and exhausting. Nora had appointed herself Frances's entire world, which was devoted and unsustainable, and Eliza was slowly working on expanding Nora's world without diminishing her love for her sister. A delicate project that was going approximately as well as delicate projects usually did, which is to say imperfectly and with incremental progress. It was a lot. There were days when Eliza looked at all of it, the number of people, the complexity of need, the logistics of the thing, and felt something close to overwhelmed, not defeated. She wasn't built for defeat exactly, but she had limits she could feel pressing against, and she'd learned slowly and with difficulty to say so. She told Gideon in April, "I need another adult, not Ruth. Well, Ruth is doing more than she should already. Someone who can take some of the nights." He looked up from his cattle reports. "What kind of adult?" "A woman. Someone who knows children." She paused. "Not someone who wants to run it. Someone who wants to help run it." He nodded slowly. "I'll put the word out." "It should be someone from outside the valley," she said. "Someone who doesn't have an existing opinion about what we're doing here." He raised an eyebrow slightly. It was the most pronounced expression of surprise he typically displayed. "People in town have started talking," she said. "What kind of talking?" She looked at him directly. She'd learned that the directness was necessary with him, that softening things for his comfort was both condescending and counterproductive, since he'd rather know accurately than feel comfortable. "The kind that happens when a man takes in a lot of children and not everyone understands why," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "And what are they saying specifically?" "Nothing specific. That's the problem. Specific things can be answered. Vague things just circulate." He set down his pen. He had the look he got when he was thinking through a problem that required thought. Not rapid-fire thinking, but the slow, careful kind. "I know Harlan Creek," he said finally. "It's not a malicious place, it's a cautious place. Those are different." "I know," she said, "but caution that gets aimed wrong is still a problem." "What do you think we should do?" She'd already thought about this. She'd been thinking about it for several weeks since she'd overheard two women talking outside the general store in town during the last supply run. She hadn't been meant to hear it. The women hadn't been trying to be cruel. They'd been genuinely puzzled, asking each other whether it was right, whether it was proper, whether someone should look into it. "We should open the ranch," she said. "Invite people in. Let them see what's here. You want to hold some kind of event. I want people to see the children living, not performing, living, having supper, doing work, being normal." She paused. "Normal is the most convincing thing there is, Ust." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a sound instinct," he said. "I know." He almost smiled. She almost did too. The spring gathering, which was not called a gathering, officially, just an open day at the Mercer Ranch, was scheduled for the third Saturday in May, and Ruth approached the planning of it with the focused energy of someone who understood that food was the fastest way to human goodwill and was prepared to use that knowledge as a strategic weapon. Eliza let Ruth command the kitchen planning entirely and focused on the other logistics. Which children should be visible in which capacities, what work should be happening organically rather than staged, how to make the day feel like an ordinary day that happened to have visitors rather than a display. "You think about it like a trial," Daniel said to her one evening, when she'd been going over the plan more than once and he'd been watching her think. "What?" "Like you're presenting evidence," he said, "to a jury." She looked at him. He wasn't wrong. "Yes," she said, "something like that." "Evidence of what?" "That this is a real place, that it works." She paused. "That it's not something to be afraid of." Daniel considered this with the practical turn of mind he applied to most things. "Henry should be working with the horses when people arrive," he said. "He's good at that. It looks right." "I thought of that." "And Willa should be where people can see her," he said. "She's 4. 4-year-olds make people trust things." She looked at him. He said it matter-of-factly, without calculation in it, just an honest assessment of how people worked. "When did you get so smart about people?" she said. "I've always been smart about people," he said. "I just wasn't smart about trusting them yet." The Saturday came with better weather than they had any right to expect in Montana in May. Clear and cool, with a light wind that smelled of the grass coming in on the lower slopes and didn't carry any threat of afternoon storms. About 30 people came, which was more than Eliza had anticipated, and it told her something about the depth of the town's curiosity. They saw Henry with the horses. They saw Daniel in the equipment shed, deep in the workings of a harrow that had been misbehaving since last fall. They saw Clara helping Ruth carry bread from the kitchen to the tables set up in the side yard, moving with the quiet competence she'd developed. And they saw Frances, impossible to miss Frances, conducting a loud and elaborate game with 3 of the younger children that involved a great deal of running and some rules that appeared to change every few minutes. They saw Eliza. She'd been uncertain how to handle herself, whether to be in the background managing things or forward and visible. She'd decided on visible because the questions people had were the kind that could only be answered by a person, and she was the person who could answer them. A woman named Mrs. Dora Aldridge approached her mid-morning. She was perhaps 50, with a forthright manner and the kind of face that had decided long ago it was going to say what it thought and live with the consequences. "You're the first one he found," Mrs. Aldridge said. Not unfriendly, direct. "Yes," Eliza said. "He found me in the blizzard last February." "And how old are you now?" 11. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her with what Eliza was coming to recognize as the particular assessment women of a certain age and temperament apply to young girls who seem older than they should be. Not suspicions, more like recognition, a remembering. "Do you go to school?" Mrs. Aldridge asked. "Mr. Mercer teaches me," Eliza said, "and the other children. We work through the county curriculum." "He teaches you?" "He and Ruth. She handles the younger one's arithmetic." A pause. "I help with reading." Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Willa, who had detached herself from Francis's game and wandered over to stand beside Eliza with the absolute confidence of someone who knew exactly whose proximity was safe. "This one's yours?" Mrs. Aldridge said. "She's not mine," Eliza said. "She's her own. She just stays close to me." "Why's that?" Willa looked up at Mrs. Aldridge with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old who hasn't yet learned to conceal her evaluations. "Eliza was there," Willa said, as though this were a complete and sufficient explanation. Mrs. Aldridge looked at the child for a moment, then back at Eliza. Something had shifted in her expression. Not softened, exactly, because it hadn't been hard to begin with, but settled. "I had some doubts," she said, which was a remarkable degree of honesty from a woman who hadn't needed to be honest. "About the arrangement here, whether it was right." "I know," Eliza said. "A lot of people have had doubts." "And?" Eliza thought about how to answer that. She could give the smooth answer, the one she'd prepared about transparency and community and the county documentation that verified everything was in order. She had that answer ready. She'd rehearsed it. Instead, she said, "I was barefoot in a blizzard with about 20 minutes of life left in me, and he brought me inside. If people have a better interpretation of what that means than what I've told you, I'd like to hear it." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long, still moment. "No," she said. "I don't think they do." The day went as days go. Not perfectly, because nothing goes perfectly. One of the older boys got into an argument with a visiting rancher's son over something that started with a comment about orphans and escalated in the way such things do. Gideon handled it with a brief, firm directness that resolved the immediate situation and left both boys privately aware that they'd been foolish, which was the best possible outcome. A table collapsed partway through the afternoon meal, which dumped an impressive amount of stew into the dust and required rapid improvisation. Francis had a spectacular crying episode around 2 in the afternoon for reasons that remained unclear and required 20 minutes of concentrated attention from Eliza before resolving. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was human. What Eliza noticed, as the day went on, was the quality of attention people brought to the children. It started as examination, people watching the children the way they'd watch anything unfamiliar, trying to assess it. But examination became something else over the course of the afternoon, something that happened naturally when you watched actual children living actual lives for long enough. It became recognition. These were children who wanted to be fed and played with and heard and given something to do. These were children who argued and laughed and got dirt on their clothes and were afraid of different things and brave about different things and were, in every observable way, simply children. By the time people started heading back to town in the early evening, the quality of their conversation had changed. Eliza couldn't hear all of it. She was occupied with cleanup and settling the younger children toward supper. But she could hear enough, and what she heard was no longer the cautious speculation she'd been monitoring. It was the ordinary talk of people who'd spent an afternoon somewhere and found it to be what it appeared to be. Gideon came to find her as the last wagon was pulling out. He stood beside her and they watched the dust settle on the road. "Well," he said. "It worked," she said. "This time." He looked at her sideways. "You're expecting more trouble." "I'm expecting more of everything," she said. "More children, more people watching, more needing to be explained and justified and defended." She paused. "It's not a complaint. It's just what it is." "Yes," he said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "We need that woman I mentioned. Another adult." "I put the word out already." "Good." He put his hands in his pockets. "You did well today," he said. She started to deflect it, started to say it wasn't her. It was the children. It was Ruth's food. It was the weather cooperating. She caught herself. "Thank you," she said. It still felt strange in her mouth, accepting things. She was working on it. The woman who came in June was named May Hutchings. She arrived on the morning stage from Billings with a single large trunk and a smaller case, and the manner of someone who had already assessed a large number of situations in her life and was prepared to assess one more. She was 40, give or take, with wide-set dark eyes and gray starting at her temples, and the kind of competence that announces itself not through any specific action, but through the way a person carries themselves in a new place. Neither anxious nor performatively confident, just present and looking, Ruth met her at the door and took her measure in about 30 seconds, which was how long Ruth needed. Eliza met her an hour later, after May had been shown her room and had her trunk brought in and had eaten something and had been given a tour of the main house. Gideon made the introductions briefly and then stepped back, which was the right instinct. He understood by now that the human architecture of the ranch ran through Eliza, and that May would need to understand that to function properly here. "He told me about you," May said. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a revelation. "What did he say?" "That you've been running the children's side of the operation since you were 10, and that you know it better than anyone, and that what you need isn't someone to take over, but someone to help carry." Eliza looked at her. That was accurate. She'd said almost those words to Gideon. "Can you do that?" Eliza said. "Help carry without taking over?" May tilted her head slightly. "Depends on whether the person carrying knows what they're doing," she said. "Do you?" "I make mistakes," Eliza said. "That's not what I asked." "Yes," Eliza said. "I know what I'm doing." "Then yes," May said. "I can do that." The summer that followed was the best they'd had. Not easy. A Montana summer on a working cattle ranch with 13 children in residence was not easy by any definition, but it had a different quality, a sense of capacity that matched the demand. May turned out to have a particular gift for the older children, especially the ones who'd arrived most recently and were still in the difficult middle stage of trust, past the initial wariness, not yet fully settled, looking for things to test. She was neither a pushover nor a disciplinarian, and she didn't pretend to know things she didn't know, which was the single quality Eliza most respected in adults. 2 more children arrived in July, brothers, 8 and 10, whose father had died, and whose mother had asked, through a network of frontier women that Eliza was only beginning to understand the scope of, whether there was room. Their names were Oliver and Sam Fitch, and they were so alike in manner that people confused them constantly, which they exploited with cheerful consistency. Then, in August, something arrived that wasn't a child. It was a letter. It came on a regular Wednesday morning with the rest of the mail, nothing that distinguished it from the outside, except the return address was from a man named Harlan Croft, who owned the Croft Land Company, which owned a considerable portion of the land in Cassidy Valley that Gideon's ranch didn't already sit on. Gideon read it at the breakfast table. Eliza, who was sitting across from him reviewing the week's supply list, watched his face, a habit she'd developed because his face was normally so still that any movement in it communicated something. Something moved in it now. "What is it?" she said. He looked up. He seemed to be making a decision about how much to tell her, and then, as she watched, he made the decision that he'd always made with her, which was to tell her all of it. "Harlan Croft would like to meet with me," he said. "He's been hearing about the ranch's situation and wants to discuss, as he puts it, a mutually beneficial arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "He doesn't say. But Harlan Croft is not a man who proposes mutually beneficial arrangements." He set the letter down. "He's a man who sees something he wants and finds a framework to take it." Eliza looked at the letter without touching it. "He wants the land," she said. "He's always wanted the land. The Mercer Ranch sits on the last private water rights in this part of the valley. Whoever controls the water controls the grazing." He paused. "What he's found is a new angle." "The children," she said. He nodded, not happily. "If he can establish that what I'm doing here is improper, legally, morally, in any form that creates public doubt, he can use that to apply pressure. Land disputes get complicated when one party's reputation is in question." Eliza thought about this carefully. She was 12 now, and 12 felt very different from 10. Not because she was wiser necessarily, but because she'd been watching people navigate complicated things for 2 years, and she'd learned that complicated things generally had a center, one thing that, if it held, kept everything else together, and one thing that, if it gave way, brought everything down. "What's his leverage?" she said. "Public opinion," Gideon said. "He doesn't need a law. He needs enough people asking the wrong questions loudly enough that the right people, county officials, the territorial authority, start looking at us with a different kind of attention. He wants people to think you're using the children somehow. Yes. For labor, or money, or any of the above. All of the above." He looked out the window. "The truth is straightforward to anyone who's paying honest attention. But Harlan Croft is very good at directing attention. Eliza sat with this for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway, she could hear the noise of breakfast being finished, dishes, voices. The particular escalating argument between Oliver and Sam that happened every morning and was usually resolved within 5 minutes by one of them capitulating for reasons that remained unclear. "You should meet with him," she said. Gideon looked at her. "Not because you owe him a meeting, because knowing what he wants specifically is more useful than guessing." She paused. "And because refusing to meet looks like you have something to hide." "It does," he agreed. "When he comes, I'll meet him at his office in town," Gideon said. "Not here. I'm not bringing him inside this house." She nodded. That was right. "Will you tell me what he says?" "Yes," he said. "All of it." What Harlan Croft said, as relayed by Gideon that evening with the careful accuracy of a man who wanted to be sure he was representing things correctly, was this. The arrangement at the Mercer Ranch was irregular. The county documentation was technically in order, but technical order was not the same as genuine oversight. He had heard concerns, from where he was vague, about the children's welfare. He thought it might be beneficial for everyone's peace of mind if the county were to conduct a formal review, and separately unconnected, he'd like Gideon to know that his offer on the Southwater rights was still open, should Gideon ever find himself in a position where a clean exit appealed. "He's filing a complaint," Eliza said. "He will, if I don't sell. That's what he's saying." "He's saying it without saying it." "Yes." Gideon looked tired in a way he didn't usually let himself look. Not defeated, she'd never seen him defeated, but weighted. The complaint on its own is manageable. Webb can handle the legal end of it. The documentation is thorough. A proper review will find exactly what it should find. "But," she said, "but the review takes time. During that time, the questions circulate, and questions that circulate long enough start becoming answers in people's minds, regardless of what the actual answers are." She thought about what Daniel had said months ago, presenting evidence to a jury. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge at the open day, starting from doubt and moving toward something different. "He's betting that even if we survive the review," she said, "we won't survive what happens to our reputation while the review is happening." "Yes." "Then we can't let the review be the only thing defending us," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" She was thinking several things at once, which was normal. She was thinking about the open day and how well it had worked. She was thinking about the network of frontier women she'd glimpsed around the edges of the Fitch brothers' arrival. She was thinking about May, who'd come from Billings and knew people there, and Ruth, who'd been in Cassidy Valley for 30 years and knew everyone, and the children themselves. 13 children who were the most straightforward evidence imaginable, visible and alive and clearly, obviously, thriving. "The complaint will be public," she said, "which means our response has to be public too." She looked at him steadily. "Not a defense. Defenses look guilty. Something else." "What kind of something else?" "The truth," she said, just louder than the questions. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamplight was the same as it always was, and the sounds of the house were settling into the evening quiet they always settled into, and somewhere upstairs she could hear May's voice, reading to the younger ones before sleep. "You're 12 years old," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you're telling me to take on Harlan Croft publicly." "I'm telling you that Harlan Croft is betting you won't," she said, "because you're a private man who doesn't like making noise. He's counted on that." She paused. "He hasn't counted on me." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The way he'd looked at her the first time, in the snow, when he'd crouched down and made a decision. Not impulsively, deliberately. "No," he said finally. "He hasn't." Outside, the valley was going dark, the same as it always did, the same darkness that had covered everything before the ranch became what it was, and would cover it long after, indifferent to all of it. Inside, the lamp burned, and the house held its people, and somewhere in Harlan Creek, a man who thought he understood the mathematics of power was about to discover that he'd miscounted something. He'd miscounted a girl who'd walked barefoot through a blizzard and still gotten back up. Harlan Croft filed his complaint with the county on a Monday. By Wednesday, Eliza knew about it from 4 separate sources, which told her something about how fast it was moving through Harlan Creek and how many people were paying attention. The first source was Aldous Webb, who sent a rider out to the ranch with a letter written in his careful, precise hand detailing the exact nature of the complaint, that the Mercer Ranch was operating as an informal institution without proper territorial oversight, that children under its care were being used as unpaid labor, and that the financial arrangement governing their housing required investigation. The language was formal and careful and entirely constructed to sound reasonable while implying everything that mattered. The second source was Ruth, who'd been to town for supplies and come back with the information packed alongside the flour and salt pork, delivered in the flat, uninflected tone she used when she was angry, but had decided anger wasn't useful. "Croft's been talking to people," Ruth said. "Not shouting, talking, quiet and reasonable, which is worse." The third was May, who had a correspondent in Billings, a woman she'd worked with before, who'd heard the name Croft in connection with a land dispute that had gone badly for a family 2 counties over. "He's done this before," May said. "Different approach, same outcome. He finds a lever and he pushes until something gives." The fourth source was Henry, who was 13 now and working in town twice a week with one of the ranch hands doing delivery runs, and who reported that 2 men he didn't recognize had been asking questions at the feed store about the Mercer Ranch. Specific questions about how many children, whether they worked, whether anyone had seen the inside of the operation. "They weren't from around here," Henry said. "Their boots were wrong for ranch work, too clean." Eliza absorbed all of this across the span of Wednesday and went to bed that night knowing she wasn't going to sleep, which proved correct. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe around her, the particular creaks and settlings of a building she knew as well as she knew her own hands. And she thought about Croft. The problem with Croft wasn't that he was powerful, though he was. The problem was that he was patient. He'd been watching Gideon's water rights for years, apparently, and he hadn't moved until he saw an angle that was better than direct confrontation. He'd waited for the ranch to become something that looked complicated from the outside. He'd waited for the children to be numerous enough that questions about their care had a kind of plausibility. He'd miscalculated one thing, but he'd calculated everything else correctly, and that required respect as a problem, even if not as a man. What he'd miscalculated was that the complicated-looking thing had a person at its center who'd spent her whole life being underestimated. She sat up in bed at some point past midnight and lit the small lamp on the table beside her and found a piece of paper. She made a list. Not of defenses. She'd meant it when she told Gideon that defenses looked guilty. What she made was a list of people. Every person who'd been to the open day in May and whose name she'd learned. Every person Ruth had mentioned over 2 years of working in Harlan Creek and knowing its social architecture. Every family that had sent a child to the ranch or inquired about the ranch or passed information through their networks that had eventually reached her. The list was longer than she expected. She put the lamp out and lay back down and looked at the ceiling and thought, he's made a mistake. Not a fatal mistake, maybe. Not yet. But a mistake. He'd assumed that a man and a girl and a hired cook and a woman from Billings running a ranch full of children were isolated. He'd assumed that because the operation was quiet and private, because Gideon was a private man, it was also without roots, without connections, without people who'd decided over 2 years of ordinary contact that what they'd seen was real. He'd confused privacy with vulnerability. In the morning, she went to find Gideon. He was in the barn, which was where he went when he needed to think without anyone watching him think. She'd learned that about him early, that the barn was his version of the thinking space she found in the account ledgers, a place where the work of his hands gave his mind room to move. He was brushing Cutter with the long, even strokes that the horse leaned into with aged contentment. He heard her come in and didn't turn immediately. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Not much. Me either." He kept brushing. "What are you thinking?" She told him about the list. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities she'd come to rely on, the willingness to hear a thing completely before responding to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to reach out to them," he said. "Not just reach out. I want to invite them in again. Not a public gathering, something smaller, families, people who've had reason to trust what they see here. Croft will say we're orchestrating testimony." "Let him say it." She paused. "He's already saying we're running a criminal operation. An orchestrated testimony would be an improvement." Gideon turned to look at her. He had the expression she'd come to know as his version of almost smiling. That's not nothing, he said. It's not everything either. She took a breath. The review will happen. Webb says probably 6 weeks out. We can't stop the process. What we can do is make sure that when the county official arrives, he's already heard from 30 people before he gets off his horse. That's not proper, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. Croft being improper first doesn't make us proper by comparison. She looked at him levelly. But the children are real, and the record is clean, and the only thing working against us is silence. I'm not willing to be silent. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned back to Cutter and made 2 more slow strokes with the brush. I'll write to Webb this morning, he said. He'll want to know what we're planning. Good. She turned to go. Eliza. She stopped. Harlan Croft is not a man who takes opposition well, he said. He said it without dramatics, the way he said most things. Just the fact of it, laid plainly. I know, she said. He'll increase the pressure when he sees we're pushing back. I know that too. You're 12 years old. You keep saying that, she said. I think you say it when you're worried about me. He was quiet for a beat. Yes, he said. I do. She looked at him. This man who'd crouched in a blizzard and picked her up and never in 2 years asked her to be smaller than she was. She felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have good language for. I'll be careful, she said. It was the closest she could come, right then, to saying what she meant. He nodded once. She left him to Cutter and the quiet of the barn and went back to the house to begin writing letters. Over the following 2 weeks, she wrote 14 letters, and Ruth delivered 12 of them personally, folded into ordinary conversation the way Ruth folded everything important, into the gaps between other things, so it didn't look like the weight it was. May wrote to her correspondent in Billings, a woman named Helen Porter, who turned out to know Aldous Webb socially and was willing to have a conversation that traveled through several hands and arrived where it needed to. Henry, on his delivery runs, stopped having only practical conversations and started listening more carefully to what the men at the feed store and the livery were actually worried about. What they were worried about, it emerged, was not primarily Gideon. What they were worried about was their own uncertainty, the way any unfamiliar thing in a small community produces a low-level unease that a careful person can amplify into something louder. Croft wasn't manufacturing the unease. He was just conducting it, the way you conduct a current that's already in the wire. The thing to do, then, wasn't to argue. It was to reduce the unease itself. Take away the thing he was conducting. This was the logic Eliza followed, and it required something she'd been building toward since the day she'd walked into town on partially healed feet for the first time and felt the way people looked at her. Not unkindly, but with the specific cautious look reserved for things that don't yet have a clear category. She needed to give them a category. She needed to give them, specifically, the truth about herself. Not managed from a distance, directly. She told Gideon, I want to speak at the town meeting. The monthly town meetings in Harlan Creek were open. Anyone could attend. Anyone could speak during the public portion. They were usually occupied by water table reports and road maintenance disputes, and the ongoing question of whether the livery needed a new roof, which had apparently been ongoing for 4 years. They were not usually occupied by 12-year-old girls with things to say. Gideon looked at her across the breakfast table. About what, specifically? About this. She gestured, meaning the ranch, the children, all of it. About what happened to me before I came here. About what I know because of what happened to me. You'd be making yourself a target, he said. I'm already a target. Croft just hasn't aimed at me specifically because he doesn't think I'm worth aiming at. She paused. That's his second mistake. What was his first? Thinking you were isolated, she said. He considered this. The meeting is Friday. I know. I'll come with you, he said. I know that too, she said, but I'll be the one talking. He nodded. He had that look again, the look that was about being worried and choosing to trust her anyway, which was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her. She spent Thursday going over what she intended to say, not writing it out. She'd tried writing it and found that reading from paper made her sound like something other than herself, and herself was the whole point. She walked the pasture in the late afternoon, talking it through quietly to the open air, and the cattle who paid no attention whatsoever, which was fine, and she found the shape of it, the bones of it. It wasn't going to be comfortable. That was the thing she kept returning to. What she needed to say was true, and the truth was not comfortable, and she'd been trying to protect herself from the discomfort of it for 2 years, and Croft had found a way to make that protection cost more than she could afford. May found her in the pasture around 4 in the afternoon. "How are you doing?" May asked. She asked it the way she asked most things, without excessive softness, which was one of the things Eliza liked about her. "I'm nervous," Eliza said. "Good," May said. "Nervous means it matters. It also means I might say it wrong." "You might?" May was quiet for a moment, standing beside her, looking at the mountains. "What's the worst version, if you say it wrong?" Eliza thought about it honestly. "People pity me," she said. "Or people don't believe me. Or I say too much and it gives Croft more to use." "And the best version?" "People understand what this place is," she said. "Not what Croft says it is, what it actually is." "What is it actually?" Eliza looked at the house. From this angle you could see the east wing windows, and if she was reading the light right, Frances was probably at the window making faces at whoever was passing below. "It's the thing I needed that didn't exist," she said, "and then it existed." May was quiet for a moment. "Say that," she said. "On Friday. Say exactly that." The Harlan Creek Town meeting was held in the largest of the 3 public buildings on the main street. A meeting hall that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays and showed evidence of both uses simultaneously. About 60 people were there, which was more than a typical Friday meeting, which meant word had traveled. Eliza had expected that. She'd half expected Croft himself to be there and was mildly surprised to find he wasn't. He'd sent instead a man she didn't recognize, who sat in the second row with a notepad and an attentive expression. Gideon sat in the back. That had been his decision, not hers. He said he wanted to be present, but not seen to be directing. And he was right. This needed to be hers. The regular business took 40 minutes, the roof, the water table. A property line dispute that appeared to have been running since before the war and showed no signs of resolution. Eliza sat in her chair near the front and kept her hands still in her lap and breathed evenly and waited. When the chairman, a heavy-set man named Orrin Baxter, who ran the hardware store and took the meeting chairman duties with quiet seriousness, opened the floor for public business, she stood up. Baxter looked at her. He knew who she was. Most people in the room did. "Miss Hale," he said. He didn't ask her to sit down, which she'd been prepared for and grateful not to have to argue against. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She hadn't been certain it would be, but it was. "I want to talk about the Mercer Ranch." The room shifted. Not dramatically. A change in the quality of attention, people straightening, the murmur of a few conversations cutting short. She didn't look at the man with the notepad. She looked at the people she recognized. Mrs. Aldridge, who had come to the open day and who looked at her now with a waiting expression. A man named Carl Bridges, who ran the livery and whose daughter had helped with the bread at the open day. Ruth, sitting near the side door, hands folded, face composed. "I was found in a blizzard," she said. "February of 1881. I was 10 years old and I was barefoot and I had about 20 minutes left in me. Gideon Mercer found me and brought me inside." She paused. "That's the beginning of the story, and I'd like to tell you the rest of it, because there's a version of that story circulating in this town right now that has the facts technically correct and everything else completely wrong." The room was quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something real is being said. She told them about the years before Gideon. Not all of it. Not the particular cruelties, not the names, not the details that would sound like a performance of suffering. But enough. The orphanage in Billings. The families that had taken her in as something between a guest and a piece of furniture. The group of travelers who'd decided she was dead weight and acted accordingly. She told it the way it had happened, plainly, without editorializing, because the facts were sufficient and didn't need embellishment, and any embellishment would make it sound like exactly the kind of manipulation she was trying to distinguish herself from. She told them what the ranch was. Again, specifically, not an argument for the ranch, not a defense of it, just what was there. Henry in the barn, and Clara with Ruth in the kitchen, and Daniel with his mechanical mind, and Willa, who stayed close to her because Willa was 4, and Eliza had been there when she needed someone to be there. She told them about the ledgers and the supply runs and the East Wing and the county documentation and web and all the ordinary machinery of the thing. Then she told them about Harlan Croft. He filed a complaint, she said. You probably know that, and there will be a review, and the review will find exactly what it should find because the record is complete and honest. But between now and the review, the questions are going to circulate, and I want to be here to answer them before they turn into something they're not." She paused. Because the questions aren't really about the children. The children are doing fine. The questions are about the water rights on the south end of the valley, and they're being asked by a man who decided the cleanest way to apply pressure to Gideon Mercer was through the thing that Gideon Mercer cares most about. She stopped. She felt the room. There was something different in it now, not the particular held breath quality of people waiting to be told what to think, but something more active. People doing their own calculations. "I'm not asking anyone to take my word for any of this," she said. "I'm asking people to come and see. I'm asking people to ask their own questions directly to the people involved, which is me and Gideon and Ruth and May Hutchins and 13 children who would tell you themselves if they were old enough to be here." She let that land for a moment. Harlan Croft is not old enough to be here, but his notepad is. Several people looked at the man in the second row. He had the look of someone who'd been hoping not to be noticed. "Thank you for your time," she said, and sat down. The room erupted. Not into chaos, but into exactly what she'd been hoping for, which was conversation. Real conversation. The messy, overlapping, interrupting kind where people are actually thinking rather than performing. Baxter tried to call order twice and gave up and let it run. Mrs. Aldridge spoke first. She stood up without being called on, which was not strictly proper procedure and which she clearly did not care about, and said loudly enough to carry, "I was out at the Mercer Ranch in May and I'd like to tell you what I saw." And then Carl Bridges said he'd been out there in June for a delivery, and he had some observations. And then a woman Eliza didn't recognize, a farmer's wife from the south end of the valley, said she'd been in correspondence with May Hutchins before May took the position, and she had some things to say about May Hutchins' character. Eliza sat in her chair and breathed and let it happen. This was the part she hadn't been certain she could trust, the part where she had to stop managing and let people reach their own conclusions. She'd done what she could. The rest was up to the room. The man with the notepad had stopped writing. He was looking at the floor. After another 20 minutes, Baxter called the formal portion of the meeting closed and let the informal portion continue, which it did for nearly an hour. Gideon came from the back of the room at some point, and people approached him, not to challenge him, but to ask specific questions, practical questions, the kind of questions that precede decisions rather than follow them. He answered them the way he answered everything, directly and without performance. Eliza found Mrs. Aldridge at one point during the ongoing conversation. "How did you know to trust it?" Eliza asked her. "At the open day. What changed your mind?" Mrs. Aldridge looked at her with the direct, unsentimental gaze she'd had from the first day. "You told me you didn't know if I was right to believe it," she said. "You didn't try to convince me. You just told me the facts and let me stand in the discomfort of not being certain." She paused. "Only honest people do that." Eliza thought about that. "I wasn't sure it would work," she said. "It doesn't always," Mrs. Aldridge said, "but it's the only thing that deserves to." She went back to the ranch that evening in the wagon beside Gideon, with Ruth on her other side and the stars coming out over the mountains in the specific order they always came out in. First the bright ones to the south, then the ones that needed the full dark to show themselves. "Well," Gideon said. "Well," she said, "Croft will know by morning what was said." "Yes." "He'll adjust his approach." "Yes." She watched the road ahead. "But he can't unhear it, and neither can the county official who's going to arrive for the review, because he's going to hear about tonight from 6 different people before he gets here." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You did something tonight that I'm not certain I could do," he said. She looked at him. "You could have," she said. "You just would have done it differently." "I would have done it worse," he said. I would have been too careful, too private." She thought about this. The thing she'd said at the meeting about needing something that didn't exist and then it existing. She'd been talking about the ranch. But she thought now about all the things that had needed to exist and hadn't, and how some of them were places and some of them were people. "Croft is going to push harder," she said. "Yes. He might reach the children directly next time. Try to get to them before we can—" "He won't," Gideon said. It came out with a certainty she hadn't heard in his voice before in quite that form, flat and absolute. He can pursue me legally, he can talk to the county, he can put whatever he wants in whatever complaint he wants. But the day anyone from Croft's operation sets foot near one of those children is the day I stop being a patient man. She looked at him. She believed him. All right, she said. They rode the rest of the way in quiet, which was how they usually traveled, because they were both people who said what they needed to say and were comfortable with the rest of the silence. The wagon wheels found the familiar ruts in the ranch road, and Cutter moved at his habitual end-of-day pace, and the house came into view with its lit windows. May would be managing the evenings. She'd been doing it efficiently and without needing instruction, and Eliza looked at it. It was not a beautiful house. It was a large, practical house that had been added to over several decades by men who cared more about function than form. And the East Wing addition didn't quite match the original structure in a way that bothered some people and bothered her not at all. It was a house that had been built by people doing what they could with what they had, and that was exactly right. The review came 5 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in late September, in the person of a county official named Foster Greer, who arrived on horseback with 2 assistants and a document case, and the professional manner of a man who'd done this kind of review before and had learned not to form opinions before forming observations. Eliza was the one who met him at the gate. He looked at her for a moment when she introduced herself, taking in the fact of her age, revising something in his initial assessment. She let him do it. "Miss Hale," he said, "you're the one who spoke at the town meeting." "Yes," she said. "I've had several people tell me about it." "Several people told you before you got here, or in the last 10 minutes?" He blinked. Then he almost smiled. "Both," he said. "Good," she said. "Come inside. I'll show you the records." The review took 2 full days. Greer went through the documentation with methodical attention. The county filings, the children's histories, the financial records, the correspondence with Webb. He walked the property. He spoke to every adult on the ranch, Gideon, Ruth, May. He spoke briefly and carefully to the older children, Henry, Daniel, Clara, the Fitch brothers. He was good at his work, Eliza noticed. He didn't lead people toward answers. He asked open questions and waited. On the evening of the second day, he sat in the study with Gideon and Eliza and his document case open on the table, and he said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," Gideon said. "I've reviewed a number of operations that claim to be doing what you're doing," Greer said. "Frontier homes, children's arrangements, informal institutions. Most of them had problems. Not always malicious problems. Sometimes just disorganization, insufficient resources, people who meant well and were in over their depth." He paused. "This is not that." "No," Gideon said, "it's not. The documentation is complete. The children's conditions are more than adequate. The children themselves speak of this place in ways that are difficult to manufacture." He looked at Eliza. "The older girl, in particular, Clara, she told me she'd learned to make bread. She told me this for approximately 4 minutes without pausing." Eliza felt something release in her chest that had been tight for weeks. "She loves making bread," she said. It was evident. Greer closed his document case. "I'll file my report within the week. I don't anticipate the finding will be anything other than satisfactory." After Greer and his assistants left the next morning, Gideon sat in the kitchen with his coffee and was quiet for a long time. Ruth had made something complicated for breakfast in celebration, which Daniel had eaten with the focused appreciation of someone who has learned that good food should be respected. "It's not over," Eliza said. She was at the table, too, her hands around her own cup. "No," Gideon agreed. "Croft will find another angle." "He will," she said. "But this one is closed." She looked at her coffee. "And we know now that we can close them." May, passing through the kitchen with an armful of laundry, paused to look at both of them. "You two are the least celebratory people I have ever met in my life," she said. Gideon looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Gideon. "The fence on the east pasture is still giving trouble," he said. "And the ledger for October needs to be started," she said. "Oh, both of you," May said, and walked out shaking her head, and from somewhere in the house came the sound of Francis apparently winning some kind of argument at significant volume, and Henry's voice carrying from the direction of the barn, and the small, ordinary sounds of the place that was not a beautiful house, and was not a perfect arrangement, and was not a smooth or clean story, and was, nevertheless, without question or qualification, home. Greer's report arrived by post 11 days after he left, addressed to Gideon, but read first by Eliza, which had become their arrangement without either of them formally deciding it. The finding was satisfactory, as he'd said it would be. The language was measured and official and entirely in their favor, and Eliza read it twice at the kitchen table before folding it and setting it beside the salt cellar for Gideon to look at when he came in from the morning rounds. He read it standing up, still in his coat. Then he set it back down and poured himself coffee, and that was that. Croft was silent for 6 weeks. Eliza didn't trust the silence. She'd learned enough about how men like Croft operated to understand that silence wasn't retreat, it was recalculation. He'd tried the formal angle, and it hadn't worked, and now he was finding another one. And the finding took time, and the time looked like silence, but wasn't. She kept the ranch running. That was the work, always. The daily, specific, uncelebrated work of keeping things going. October brought the first real cold of the season, and with it the annual anxiety about wood supply, which Daniel had taken on as his personal domain with an organizational intensity that surprised even Eliza. He'd spent the summer calculating, and he presented her in early October with a hand-drawn chart of expected consumption rates and current inventory that was more thorough than anything she'd seen an adult put together. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked. "You," he said. "I watched how you do the ledgers." She looked at the chart again. "This is better than the ledgers," she said. He shrugged, trying not to look pleased and failing. "The ledgers have a better format," he said. "I'll redo it." "Don't," she said. "This is fine. Use it." He used it. The wood supply held through October and November with a precision that Ruth called uncanny, and that Eliza called the natural result of paying attention, which was, in her experience, the source of most things that looked like uncanny. Henry turned 14 in November and asked, with the directness that had become his defining characteristic, whether he could start taking on more responsibility with the cattle rather than just the horses. He wanted to learn the full operation, he said. Not because he was planning to leave, he said this specifically, preemptively, because he'd apparently noticed that people sometimes interpreted ambition as preparation for departure, but because he wanted to understand the whole thing. Gideon took him on the full South pasture rounds for a week and reported back that Henry had a better eye for cattle health than 3 of his paid hands, and that this was not a compliment to his paid hands. "What do you want to do with it?" Eliza asked Henry when he came back from the week looking older somehow, in the particular way outdoor work ages a person usefully. Eventually. Henry thought about it. "Stay," he said. "Help run it." She looked at him. He was almost as tall as Gideon now, with the build of someone who was going to be large and didn't quite know it yet. She thought about the 9-year-old who'd arrived holding Willa's hand with the stubborn protectiveness of someone who had decided that being in charge of something was the only way to survive losing everything. "All right," she said. Is that... He stopped. He did that sometimes, started sentences and lost them in the middle, which happened when he was uncertain how to ask for something without asking for it. "It's your home," she said. "You stay as long as you want." He nodded. He didn't say anything else, which was Henry's version of the most significant response available to him. Croft moved again in December, and this time he was smarter about it. He didn't file another complaint. He didn't use the county machinery at all, which was the tell. He'd understood from the review that the official record was clean and that attacking it directly was a losing game. What he did instead was purchase, through an intermediary the connection to whom took Webb 3 weeks to trace, the land adjacent to the ranch's north water access. It was legal. It was entirely legal. The land had been owned by an elderly farmer named Deakins, who'd been looking to sell for 2 years, and Croft's intermediary had offered a fair price, and the transaction had gone through without anyone at the ranch knowing about it until it was done. Gideon explained it to Eliza at the kitchen table on a December evening with the kind of measured, deliberate calm that she'd learned to recognize as the way he controlled anger rather than the absence of it. "The north access isn't our primary water source," he said. "The south water rights are. But the north access is where we run the cattle in the late summer when the south pastures are recovering." "And he owns it now," she said. "He owns the land around it, not the access itself. There are easement laws. But easements can be disputed, and disputes take years. And in the meantime, he can make the access difficult in ways that are technically legal and practically destructive. He set his hands flat on the table. He's not trying to win outright anymore. He's trying to make it expensive to stay. She thought about this. Outside, the December wind was doing what December wind did in Montana, which was to make the house feel simultaneously more vulnerable and more necessary. "What does Webb say?" she said. "That we have a case on the easement, that the case is solid, that it will take between 2 and 4 years to fully resolve and will cost considerably in legal fees during that time." A pause. He also says that Croft almost certainly has another move after this one, that this is a campaign, not a battle. "It's always been a campaign," she said. "He's just doing it openly now." Gideon looked at her. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question honestly because he always deserved honesty. "No," she said. "I'm tired." She paused. "There's a difference. Frightened means I think we're going to lose. Tired means I wish the winning were easier." Something moved in his face. He looked down at his hands on the table. "I'm sorry," he said. She frowned. "For what?" "For bringing this onto you. You didn't—" He stopped, reorganized. "You came here because you were dying in a blizzard. You didn't sign up for land disputes and county complaints and Harlan Croft." She looked at him for a moment. In 4 years, she'd never heard him apologize for anything about the ranch, because there'd been nothing to apologize for. The ranch was what it was, and she'd chosen to be part of it as clearly as anyone could choose anything. "You pulled me out of a blizzard," she said. "I didn't sign up for that either. It happened, and then I decided what to do with it." She held his gaze. "I decide what to do with this too. You don't get to apologize for the things I've chosen." He was quiet for a long moment. "Besides," she said, "if you'd left me in the snow, I'd have missed everything that came after, which I'm not prepared to miss." He looked at her with an expression that was so much more than the near smile she'd learned to read over 4 years. Something fuller and harder to name, the way the most real things are usually harder to name than the ones that aren't. "All right," he said, "we fight the easement." "We fight the easement," she agreed. "And we get Webb to look at what Croft's intermediary paid for that land, because if he paid below assessment value, we have a different kind of problem for him." Gideon looked at her. "You think there's something there?" "I think men who do things through intermediaries are usually hiding something about the transaction," she said. "And I think it's worth looking." Webb found something there. It took until February, but he found it. The sale price had been properly documented, but the assessment value had been artificially lowered 3 months before the sale by a county assessor who turned out to have had a prior business relationship with one of Croft's legitimate subsidiaries. It was not a smoking gun, the kind of clean, single proof that ends things immediately, but it was a thread, and threads, properly pulled, could unravel considerable amounts of fabric. The winter was hard in the way Montana winters are always hard, which is without mercy and without apology, but the ranch had become practiced at hardness. They had wood enough because Daniel's chart had held. They had food enough because Ruth's planning had been excellent, and Gideon's cattle operation funded the household accounts at a level that the previous years had established as reliable. They had people enough, 14 children now, May, Ruth, 3 regular ranch hands who'd been with Gideon for years and had watched the East Wing fill up with something between skepticism and respect, settling lately on the respect side. What they had that was harder to quantify, but more important than any of the practical things, was a quality of— Eliza kept reaching for the word and not finding quite the right one. Solidarity was too formal. Family felt both right and insufficient. What she kept coming back to was simply, they knew each other. After 4 years of daily proximity and shared difficulty, they knew each other's patterns and limits and specific fears and the particular sounds each person made in the mornings before they were fully awake. That kind of knowing was its own form of wealth, and it was the one thing Croft couldn't touch. Willa turned 6 in the late winter and had developed over the 2 years since she'd arrived into a person of strong opinions and considerable verbal capacity. She had opinions about which boots belonged on which feet, in what order, and about the proper way to eat porridge, and about why Frances's way of playing the game they'd invented was less correct than her own way of playing the game they'd invented. She stated these opinions at length and with conviction and without much concern for whether her audience had requested them. She had also decided at some point that Eliza was the closest thing she had to an older sister, which Eliza had not sought and did not know how to disclaim and had gradually stopped trying to disclaim. It was just true. Willa was her small sister in the way that mattered, not biologically, not legally, but in the way that 4 years of being the person Willa looked for when she was scared had made it true. On Willa's birthday, Willa told her, "When I grow up, I want to do what you do." Eliza was making Willa's birthday dinner, or helping Ruth make it, which meant standing at Ruth's elbow, following instructions and not improving on them, which was harder than it sounded because Eliza's instinct was always to improve on things. "What do I do?" she said. "You make sure things are all right," Willa said, with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who has figured out the essential thing and is reporting it. Eliza looked at her. She was going to say something practical, something about how it wasn't just her, it was Gideon and Ruth and May and everyone. She caught herself. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Willa said, and went back to whatever she'd been doing, which appeared to involve reorganizing the kitchen chairs according to a principle Eliza couldn't identify. The spring brought the legal process into its working phase. Depositions, documentation, Webb flying back and forth between the ranch and Harlan Creek, and twice to the territorial capital on matters that he explained in detail and that Eliza followed closely and that she summarized for Gideon, who trusted Webb's expertise but preferred to understand the shape of things rather than just the outcome. It also brought Harlan Croft himself to the ranch for the first and only time. He came on a Wednesday morning in April without announcement, which was a choice. Men like Croft understood the tactical value of arriving before you were expected. He was older than Eliza had imagined, closer to 70 than 60, with the build of someone who'd been physically powerful in earlier decades and was still impressive in the way that structures are impressive when the work they were built for has changed, but the structure remains. He had a quality of composed authority that she recognized as having been cultivated over many years, and that was clearly meant to do a specific thing to people. Make them feel that the hierarchy of the situation had been established before anyone opened their mouths. She was the one who met him at the door because she was the one who happened to be there when she heard the horse. He looked at her. She looked at him. He took in her age with the particular recalibration that people always did, and she watched him do it and waited. "I'm here to see Gideon Mercer," he said. "He's in the south pasture," she said. "You could wait inside or I could send someone for him." He looked at her for another moment. She could feel him deciding something about her, what kind of thing she was, what weight to give her, what the correct approach was. "I'll wait inside," he said. She brought him to the study because that was the room with the best chair and also the room that showed the most clearly what the operation was. The ledgers, the correspondence files, the county documentation organized along the side wall in the filing system she'd developed 2 years ago. She offered him coffee, which he accepted, and sat across from him in her usual chair with her hands in her lap and her face neutral. "You're Eliza Hale," he said. "Yes." "You spoke at the town meeting last year." "Yes." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She noticed his hands. They were the hands of a man who'd done physical work, which was interesting since his current occupation was entirely administrative. He'd built something once before he became someone who took things. "I want you to understand something," he said. "I don't have a personal interest in destroying what Mercer's built here. I have an interest in land and water rights that is entirely separate from what happens to the children in this house." "I know that," she said. He looked faintly surprised. "You know it." "It makes it worse," she said. "Not better. You're willing to damage what's here as a side effect of getting what you want. That's not the same as not caring about it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that was harder to read than most things she'd been looking at for 4 years. Not anger, she thought. Something more complicated. "How old are you?" he said. 13. "And Mercer put you in charge of receiving me." "Mercer doesn't know you're here," she said. "I made the decision to bring you inside. He'd have made the same one, but he's not here, and I am." Croft looked at her steadily. She looked back with the same steadiness. This was something she'd learned, not confidence exactly, since confidence implied certainty she didn't always have. It was more like She was not going to be the first one to look away, and she was not going to manage what showed on her face any more than she managed it normally, which was not very much. The easement dispute will go on for years, he said. I want you to understand that. Whatever Webb thinks he found in the assessment records, it's not sufficient to change the fundamental reality of the situation. Webb thinks differently, she said. But you didn't come here to talk about the easement. He stopped. You came here because something changed your calculation, she said. Something about the situation as it is doesn't work for you the way it did when you started, and you want to see the place in person to understand what you're dealing with. He looked at her for a long moment. He put the coffee cup down. You're correct, he said. What changed? She said. He was quiet for a moment. It was the first time she'd seen him be quiet when he could have spoken, and it told her something. I had a report, he said, from the man who attended the town meeting. He described your remarks. A pause. And then I had a conversation with Foster Greer, who conducted the review. He's a man whose professional judgment I respect. What did Greer say? He said the children in this house are the best evidence he's seen in 20 years of this kind of work that the thing you're all doing here is real. Croft said it in the flat, factual tone of someone reporting a piece of intelligence that has required adjustment of their prior position. He said the girl who spoke at the town meeting struck him as one of the more substantial people he'd encountered in the course of his professional duties. She sat with that for a moment. He also said, Croft continued, that he believed that if I continued pursuing this particular approach, the eventual public outcome would be significantly worse for my reputation than for Mercer's, given the current state of the record and the community sentiment. She understood then. He'd come here not because he'd lost. He hadn't lost. The legal processes were ongoing and genuinely uncertain, but because he'd done the longer calculation and found something he hadn't expected to find at the end of it. What do you want? She said. I want to understand whether there's an arrangement that doesn't require 10 years of litigation, he said. She was quiet for a moment. This was the moment that required the most care of anything she'd encountered, because the wrong move here was easy. Agreement that gave away too much, refusal that closed a door that maybe shouldn't be closed. She didn't have Gideon here. She didn't have Webb. She had herself and 4 years of watching how things worked. Gideon makes those decisions, she said. Not me. I'll send for him. She paused. But I want to say one thing first, and I want you to hear it before he gets here. Go ahead, Croft said. She looked at him directly. Whatever arrangement gets made, about the land, about the water rights, about the legal processes, it has nothing to do with what happens to the children in this house. That's not a negotiating point. That's not something that goes on the table. What's here continues. If any arrangement makes that harder rather than easier, we don't make the arrangement. He looked at her for a long moment. Understood, he said. She sent Daniel to find Gideon, and Gideon came in 20 minutes later with the look of someone who'd been told something on the way to the house and was composing himself in the time remaining. He looked at Croft. Croft looked at him. They had the look of two men who'd been circling each other for a long time and were now, unexpectedly, in the same room. Eliza left them to it, not because she wasn't needed, but because she understood that the room would work better with 2 people in it than 3, and she'd already said the thing that needed to be said before Gideon arrived. She went to the kitchen, where Ruth was preparing the afternoon meal with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been feeding people for 30 years. Croft's here, Eliza said. Ruth looked up. She looked at Eliza's face. How are you? She said. Strange, Eliza said. It's strange to see him as an actual person. Ruth handed her a knife and a pile of carrots without being asked. Evil doesn't usually look like anything interesting, Ruth said. He's not evil, Eliza said. Cutting carrots was the right thing to do. Her hands steadied on the work. He's just someone who wanted something and was willing to damage things to get it. That's not unusual. No, Ruth said. It's not. They worked together in silence for a while, and from the study came the low, unintelligible sound of 2 men having a serious conversation, and around them the house went about its afternoon in its ordinary way. Willa's voice somewhere upstairs, the sound of Clara's careful footsteps on the back stairs, the distant work sounds from the barn that were always in the background of everything. The conversation in the study lasted 2 hours. When Gideon came to find her afterward, he had the look of someone who'd gone into a difficult thing and come out the other side, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but settled. The way a person looks when something that's been unresolved for a long time has found a resolution, even if it isn't the resolution they wanted. He'll withdraw the easement challenge, he said. The legal claim on the north access stays clean. He keeps the land he purchased, but the access is formally guaranteed by a permanent easement agreement that Webb will draw up. And the assessment irregularity gets referred to the county. He doesn't contest the referral. He says, and I believe him, that the assessor acted independently and he didn't direct it, only benefited from it. You believe him about that? Gideon considered it. I believe it's possible he didn't direct it specifically. I believe he created conditions where such things could happen without his direct knowledge and without his minding very much. He paused. That's not innocence, but it's different from the specific thing. She thought about this. It was complicated in the way that most real things were complicated. Not a clean resolution, not a villain admitting villainy and departing, but something murkier and more human. What does he want in exchange? She said. Nothing contractual. He wants the litigation to end, same as we do. He said. Gideon paused, chose his words. He said he'd been told things about this place that caused him to believe it was less substantial than it is. He acknowledged that his information was incomplete. Who told him things? She said. He didn't say. I didn't push it. She nodded. That was right. Pushing it would have soured the room and probably ended in lies anyway. He's a man who made a calculation, Gideon said. The calculation changed. He adjusted. That's not... She stopped. It's not justice, he said. No, it's not. He looked out the window. Justice would require him to understand what it costs when you apply that kind of pressure to something fragile. He doesn't understand that. He never will. She thought about what the last year had been. The complaint, the review, the town meeting, the easement, all the hours Webb had spent and that she'd spent and that Gideon had spent, the quiet weight of it sitting on the ranch through 2 seasons. No, she said, he won't. But it's over, Gideon said. This part of it. She looked at her hands. The carrot smell was still on them from the kitchen. Yes, she said, this part. They stood there for a moment in the study, the room that had been the center of so many of the things that mattered, where she'd first sat across from him working the ledgers at 10 years old, where Croft had drunk his coffee 2 hours ago, where the lamp burned in the evenings while they worked. I need to tell you something, Gideon said. The tone of it made her look at him, not alarmed. His voice wasn't alarmed, but attentive. I saw Webb in town last month, he said, for something else, for something personal. He looked at her steadily, which was how he looked at things he'd decided to say directly. There's been something wrong with my heart for about a year, a problem with the rhythm of it. The doctor in Harlan Creek identified it. Webb visited with a specialist in Billings on my behalf. She was very still. It's not immediately... I'm not... He stopped. I'm not dying this month. I want to be clear about that. But it's a real thing, and it's going to get more real over time, and I need you to know. She looked at him. She thought about a lot of things simultaneously, which was what her mind did when it received information that required adjustment of everything she'd assumed was fixed. She thought about the documents he'd had Webb prepare 3 years ago. She thought about what he'd said then. I'm not a young man, Eliza. I'm just being sensible. She thought about Henry and Daniel and Clara and Willa and Francis and the Fitch brothers and Peter and all the rest of them, and the East Wing, and the ledgers, and the legal documents with her name in them. She thought about Cutter, who was 20 years old and moved with the careful economy of age. How long? She said. Unknown, he said. Years, possibly. Less, possibly. The specialist says it's variable. He held her gaze. What I know is that we have time to do this right, to prepare it properly. The documents are in order. Webb knows what to do. May is here. You know the operation better than I do at this point. I don't know, she started. You do, he said, simply and completely, and in the way he had of saying things that didn't argue because they were true. You've known it for 2 years. You've just been knowing it alongside me, which is how it should be, and then it will be alongside Henry and May and whoever else you bring in, which is also how it should be. She was not going to cry. That wasn't a decision she'd made in this moment. It was something deeper, a way she'd learned to be. And she'd been crying less than she used to anyway, which she'd thought was growing up but might also have been having less to cry about. She was not going to cry, and she was not going to pretend this was all right, and she was not going to manage her face for his benefit. "I hate this," she said. "I know," he said. "You should have told me sooner." "Yes," he said. "I should have." He didn't make excuses for it. That was consistent with him, the willingness to take a correction without deflecting. "Are you in pain?" "Not consistently. Sometimes." She breathed. "All right," she said. "All right. What does the specialist say you should do differently?" "Less physical exertion, which means the heavy work." "I'll restructure the schedule," she said. "Henry can take the South Pasture rounds entirely. Daniel can handle the heavy equipment with Ed and Joe." She was already moving through it, the way her mind worked best, from the impossible emotional thing toward the practical thing, which was the only way she knew how to be useful with fear. "You'll still do the accounts with me?" "Yes," he said. "And you'll tell me when it gets worse," she said. "You won't manage it quietly. You'll tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I'll tell you." "Good." She looked at the desk. The ledgers were there, the same as always. The lamp was dark in the afternoon light coming through the window. Outside, the sounds of the ranch went on, the ordinary sounds that had become, over 4 years, the sound of her life. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever happens," he said, "you were the best decision I ever made." She looked at him steadily. This man who'd crouched in a blizzard when he could have ridden past, who'd never demanded anything from her except honesty, who'd put her name in legal documents when she was 11 years old because he looked at a child that everyone else had called dead weight and saw something worth trusting with everything he'd built. "You were mine too," she said. The afternoon light came through the window at the long going gold angle of April in Montana, and somewhere in the kitchen Ruth was finishing the meal, and from outside came Henry's voice and the sound of horses, and the life of the place went on around them in its unbeautiful, imperfect, absolutely essential way, holding all its people inside it against whatever was coming next. Gideon lived 2 more years after he told her. That was not what the specialist had projected. The specialist had been cautiously optimistic about 3 to 5, which turned out to be the particular cruelty of cautious optimism, that it sets the shape of what you're prepared for, and then the actual thing arrives in a different shape entirely. He had a bad episode in the summer of the first year that put him in bed for 3 weeks, and from which he recovered, mostly, though the recovery left him diminished in ways that accumulated quietly rather than announcing themselves. He had a better autumn than expected. He had a winter that was hard in the way his winters had always been hard. He was a man who felt cold more than he let on, and had been since she'd known him, and the cold now cost him more than it used to. He died in April of the 2nd year, on a morning that was clear and cold with the particular freshness of early spring, which Eliza would think about later. The coincidence of seasons, how he'd found her in the worst of winter and left in the beginning of something else. He died in his own bed, in his own house, with Ruth sitting on one side of him, and Eliza on the other, and May in the doorway, because the room didn't hold 3 people comfortably, and May had understood that without being told. He wasn't in pain at the end, or at least not in the visible way. He'd been sleeping more than waking for 2 days, and the sleeping had become the other thing gradually, and there was a moment when Eliza understood that the breathing had stopped, and that the specific quality of stillness in the room had changed, and that was that. Ruth sat quietly for a long time after. Eliza sat quietly too. Eventually she got up and went to tell the children. She told them in the main room, all of them together, which was the right way. Not softened beyond recognition, not with the excessive management of emotion that children learn to distrust, but plainly and fully. She told them what had happened, and she told them it was real, and she told them it was going to hurt, and that the hurting was correct because he'd been worth knowing. Henry didn't cry, which was Henry's way, but he went out to the barn immediately after and stayed there for 4 hours, and she let him. Daniel did cry, which had become less unusual as the years had gone on, and he'd learned that crying wasn't the same as losing. It was just water, he'd told her once, the body's way of getting rid of something that didn't fit inside anymore. Clara cried quietly and held Francis, who cried loudly, which was also Francis's way. The Fitch brothers sat close together and didn't talk much, which was their version of the same thing Henry was doing in the barn. Willa, who was 8 now and understood more than she had at 4, came and sat beside Eliza and put her hand in Eliza's hand and didn't say anything. That was the right thing. It was exactly the right thing. And Eliza held Willa's hand and felt the smallness of it and thought, this is what he built. Not the land or the cattle or the legal documents. This, a child who knew how to sit with someone in grief, who'd learned it here, in this house, in this life. She was 15 years old and she was in charge of everything. She didn't feel ready, which she'd learned was not actually the relevant measure. Ready was what you felt before things happened. After things happened, what you felt was responsible, and responsibility and readiness were entirely different animals. Responsibility didn't ask if you were prepared. It just showed up. She'd been preparing for 2 years since the April afternoon when Gideon had told her about his heart, and she'd spent those 2 years learning every dimension of the operation that she hadn't fully known, which wasn't much. She knew the cattle accounts and the supply arrangements and the legal structure and the water rights and the relationship with Webb, who had become something between a professional advisor and a concerned family friend over the years. She knew the ranch hands, Ed, Joe, and the newer one, a young man named Cal, who'd come the previous summer and was good and honest and had the qualities she'd learned to look for, which was a willingness to be corrected without being broken by it. What she was less certain of was the human weight of it, the managing of it not as a logistical system but as a living thing, a community of people with needs that didn't organize themselves neatly into categories. She'd been doing that too, alongside Gideon, but alongside was different from alone. The week after the funeral, a small gathering, no ceremony because Gideon had been a private man and she honored that. She sat down with May and Henry in the study, and they talked about what came next. The will and the trust are in order, she said. Webb's managing the legal transition. The ranch stays in operation under the trust until I'm of age, at which point the formal deed transfers. She'd been over this with Webb twice and understood the structure completely. The operating funds are sufficient. The cattle operation is profitable, and we've been running a modest surplus for 3 years. The surplus should be directed somewhere, Henry said. He was 16 now, taller than Gideon had been, with the same quality of deliberateness that seemed to be something this place developed in people over time. Not just held. If we're going to expand what we're doing, one thing at a time, May said. No, Eliza said. He's right. We should talk about what expanding looks like. She looked at her hands on the desk, the same lamp, the same ledgers that had just changed hands. Gideon built this to hold what came to us. I think we should start reaching further than waiting for things to come. Meaning what? May said. Meaning we should know what's happening in the counties around us. Who's in trouble? Who's falling through? She thought of Potts, the county man who'd come that first March with news of the Draper children. She thought of all the networks she'd come to understand over 5 years. The Frontier Women's correspondents, the relay station operators, the writers who moved through the territory and knew things. We should be part of those networks instead of waiting at the edges. May looked at her. That's a significant expansion of scope. Yes, Eliza said. You're 15, May said. You sound like Gideon, Eliza said. May smiled, not the almost smile that Gideon had always used, but a full one, which was May's way, more open than his had been. He'd be saying it, she said. You know that. He'd be saying it, and then he'd agree with me, Eliza said, also like Gideon. Henry made a sound that was close to a laugh. The room was quiet for a moment in the particular way it was quiet when the people in it were all feeling the same absent presence. All right, May said, we start making contacts. We don't overextend the resources. She looked at Henry. You know the cattle operation well enough to manage it without Eliza's constant involvement. Have been managing it, he said. It wasn't boastful, just accurate, which was also Henry's way. Then she focuses on the children's side and the expansion of reach, May said. I take more of the daily management of the house. We divide it properly instead of having it all fall on one person. Eliza looked at May. There was something she needed to say, and she wasn't certain how to say it, because it was the kind of thing that felt large inside her chest and small when put into words. I couldn't do this without you, she said. May looked at her with the level, direct gaze she'd had from the first day she'd arrived from Billings. I know, she said. That's not a weakness. That's sense. He found you, Eliza said. He put the word out, and you came, and you were the right person. He had a good instinct for people, May said. So do you. I make mistakes, Eliza said. Yes, May said. So do I. So did he. She paused. The difference between people who do real work and people who only talk about it is that the people who do real work make mistakes in the middle of doing something, not before they start. Eliza thought about that. Then she picked up the account ledger. The new one, the one she'd started for the current year with the Mercer Ranch heading written in her own hand rather than his, and opened it to the first working page. Right, she said. Let's start. The next 3 years were the hardest and the most important of her life, which was saying something given what the first 15 had contained. She made mistakes. She was honest about this, then and later, because she thought the refusal to be honest about it was one of the ways people who did important work eventually failed. They built a story about their own competence that became more important than the actual work, and then they defended the story instead of correcting the mistakes. And things fell apart in the specific way that things fall apart when the people managing them stop being able to see clearly. She hired a woman in the spring of her 16th year to help May with the house management, a widow from south of the valley named Vera Cook, who turned out to have a gift for the very young children that nobody had anticipated, including Vera herself. She hired Cal's younger brother the following summer to help with the cattle operation when Henry's responsibilities grew to the point where he needed support. She made both of those decisions correctly. She also made the decision in her 17th year to take in a family. Not orphan children, but an entire intact family, parents and 3 children, who'd been burned out of their homestead by a fire and had nowhere to go through the winter. She made the decision quickly because the need was immediate, and she didn't consult May before making it, and May was right to be frustrated with her about it, and the frustration lasted 2 days, and then they both moved on because the family was there and needed feeding, and the argument about process could wait. The family, the Shaws, stayed 4 months. When they left in the spring with a rebuilt stake and enough supplies to get the new homestead started, the father shook Eliza's hand and then, catching himself, looked at her. She was 17, tall now, with the particular quality of presence she'd been building since she was 10, and said, I don't know how to thank you. Don't, she said, just do the same when you can. He nodded. She meant it as a practical instruction, not a sentiment. That was the distinction she'd come to understand most clearly in those years of running the ranch. There were people who understood that help was a practice, a thing you did repeatedly and imperfectly and without keeping score. And there were people who understood it as an event, a moment of exceptional goodness that stood apart from ordinary life. The first kind built things that lasted. The second kind burned bright and finished. Gideon had been the first kind. She intended to be the first kind. Daniel left when he was 16 to apprentice with a machinist in Billings who'd heard about his abilities through the same networks that had sent children to the ranch. He left on a Tuesday morning with a bag that was insufficient for the trip and an expression that was trying to be practical and was mostly heartbroken, and Eliza walked him to the road and stood there while he got into the wagon that was taking him to the stage. Right, she said. All right, he said. Write more than you think you need to, she said. I worry more than I show. He looked at her. He'd grown into someone she was proud of, not in the way you're proud of a creation, but in the way you're proud of a person who did the work of becoming themselves, which is the harder and more interesting pride. I know you worry, he said. You always have? He paused. It means something, that you worry about people. Don't make it noble, she said. It keeps me up at night. Yeah, he said, I know that too. He wrote. He wrote more than she expected, long letters full of what he was learning and the people he was meeting and the specific mechanical problems he was solving, and occasionally, buried in the practical information, a line or two about how he was doing in the deeper sense, which was the part she read most carefully. He was doing well. He was doing better than well. He was, in the most meaningful sense of the word, thriving. And the thriving had been built on the foundation of what the ranch had given him, which was not rescue. She'd stopped thinking about it as rescue somewhere along the way, because rescue implied a single dramatic moment, and what the ranch offered was something more sustained and less dramatic than that. What it offered was continuity, a place that was there every day. Clara, at 14, had become the person Ruth had been seeing in her since the first days. Careful, precise, with a domestic competence that went far beyond cooking into the management of a complex household, and with a quiet authority that worked differently from Eliza's but with equal effectiveness. She'd started helping May manage the newer children, and she did it with the particular patience of someone who remembered what the first days felt like and had not decided to forget. Henry stayed. That had been his answer 3 years ago, and it remained his answer. And by the time he was 19, he was running the cattle operation with Ed as his second and 2 additional hired hands. And the operation was more profitable than it had been under Gideon, not because Henry was more skilled than Gideon, but because he'd grown into it at exactly the right time, with Gideon's knowledge available to him in the years before it was needed. Willa, at 10, was primarily interested in horses and numbers, and in pointing out when Eliza was wrong about things, which Eliza accepted because Willa was correct at a statistically impressive rate, and because she'd learned, over years of running things, that the people most valuable to any operation were not the ones who agreed with you, but the ones who disagreed with you accurately. "You're wrong about the north fence line schedule," Willa told her one morning, in the kitchen, over breakfast, with the complete confidence of someone who has done the arithmetic. Eliza looked at her. "Show me why." Willa showed her. She was right. "Adjust the schedule," Eliza said. "I already did," Willa said, and went back to her breakfast. Eliza sat there for a moment, looking at this 10-year-old who'd arrived 4 years ago crying without stopping and who was now the person who corrected the north fence schedule, and she felt something that she didn't have exact language for, but that she thought was the closest thing she knew to the feeling Gideon must have had, watching her work. It wasn't pride, quite. It was more specific than pride. It was the feeling of watching something you'd put work into become more than the work. Like you'd planted something and what grew was itself, not just what you'd planted. The referral network grew. She'd been building it since Gideon died, with the steady, patient work of someone who understood that networks are not built by announcement, but by the accumulated weight of trust. She'd cultivated the connections carefully, the county workers, the stage relay operators, the Frontier Women's correspondence chains, the occasional letter from people who'd heard about the Mercer Ranch and wanted to know if it was real, and if so, how it worked. She answered those letters personally. Some of them led nowhere. Some of them led to children, not always orphan children, not always simple situations. There was a girl of 12 who'd been surviving alone for 6 months after her parents died, in a homestead too remote for anyone to have noticed, found by a rider who'd passed through and recognized the wrongness of what he was seeing. There were brothers, 11 and 9, whose father was alive but unable and whose mother had written, through 3 intermediaries, asking whether there was somewhere safe for them to be while she dealt with what needed dealing with. The mother came back in 8 months and took her boys home, which was the outcome Eliza had hoped for and worked toward, helping her from a distance with resources and contacts while the boys were at the ranch. That one was complicated in ways that no simple story about rescue could accommodate. She thought about that a lot. The complicated ones. The story people wanted to tell about the Mercer Ranch, and she was aware by now that people told stories about it, that it had become a kind of known thing in the territory. It was a simple story. Man with a good heart takes in orphan children. Girl saves girl. Ranch saves everyone. The end. She didn't correct the story because simple stories did useful work in the world. They made people open doors, donate supplies, pass information, trust the network. But she knew the real story was nothing like that, and the real story was the one she lived inside every day. The real story was, things go wrong, repeatedly and specifically, and you manage the wrongness, and then you manage the next wrongness, and occasionally you get a Wednesday in June where nothing is urgent, and the light is good, and everyone is fed, and those Wednesdays accumulate into something that people later call a life, and sometimes call a legacy. And what makes them possible is not heroism, but the grinding, ordinary, under-celebrated work of showing up every day and doing what needs doing. The real story was Daniel's chest illness in December and the specific fear of those nights. The real story was the Croft situation and the weeks of managing uncertainty while the ranch ran and the children needed breakfast regardless. The real story was Gideon's handwriting in the ledgers that she couldn't quite make herself replace with her own. Not for years. Not until the pages filled and she had to start new ones and the old ones were just records now. History. A handwriting she could still read perfectly. The real story was Willa's hand in her hand on the morning Gideon died, and how much that small, certain hand had held. She was 18 when Aldous Webb completed the formal transfer of the deed. He made the trip from Harlan Creek on a Thursday morning with the same leather case he'd brought the first time, 7 years ago, and he laid the documents on the desk and she signed them with the pen that had been Gideon's and was hers now. "Congratulations," Webb said. She looked at the paper, at her own name on it, at the formal language of ownership and responsibility, and all the legal machinery that expressed in official terms what had been true for years now in every practical sense. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you've done, for all of it." Webb looked at her over his case with the expression he'd had the very first time, that slight recalibration, the reassessment of what he was dealing with. "Gideon Mercer was one of the better men I've known in 40 years of legal practice," he said, "and he was right about you." She held his gaze. "What did he say?" "About me?" "He said you were the best decision he'd ever made," Webb said. "He said it more than once." She looked back at the document. She breathed evenly. "I'll need you to draw up some additional documentation," she said, when she had herself organized. "The referral network has grown to the point where I think it needs a formal structure. Not the ranch itself, that stays as it is, but the network around it, the way we receive children and communicate with counties and connect families to resources. I want it legal and clear." Webb took out his notepad. "Tell me what you're thinking." She told him. She'd been thinking about it for a year, and the shape of it was clear. It was not simple. It was going to be a complicated legal structure that required careful construction, but Webb was good at complicated structures, which was why she trusted him. He wrote for 15 minutes, asking clarifying questions in the precise, minimal way that was his professional manner, and by the end he had what he needed. "I'll have a draft in 3 weeks," he said. "Good," she said. "Send it when it's ready." He left, and she sat in the study alone for a while. Outside, through the window, she could see the pasture in its summer state, the grass green from a good spring, the cattle moving in their habitual afternoon pattern, Henry visible in the distance on horseback, doing his rounds with the unhurried efficiency he'd made his professional signature. She thought about what it meant to be in a place, not to visit it or pass through it or depend on it temporarily, to be in it, woven into it, responsible for it, marked by it and marking it in return. She'd been 10 years old the first time she'd seen these pastures through the window of a room she was recovering in, her feet destroyed and her body wrung out from the blizzard, everything uncertain. She was 18 now, and she knew every acre of this land and every person under this roof, and the sound the wind made in the east wing in October when it came off the mountains in that specific direction. She knew the water rights and the easement agreement and the cattle account ledgers and the referral network contacts and the names and histories of every child who'd passed through in 8 years. She knew who'd stayed and who'd left, and how the leaving went, because the leaving always went a particular way. Harder than anyone expected, better than anyone feared, and marked on both ends by the knowledge that the door was still there. The door was always still there. That was the thing she'd come to believe most deeply, maybe the thing she believed most deeply about anything. The door should always be there. Not to obligate people to stay, not to make leaving feel like failure, but because the knowledge that you could come back is sometimes what makes it possible to go forward. She'd understood this in theory for years. She understood it in her body now, in the way she understood the things she'd learned through living rather than thinking. This was what she'd tell them, the ones who left, Henry's age now and younger, making their first moves into the world beyond the ranch gate. She didn't make speeches. That wasn't her way. But she said it when it mattered, said it in the plain, direct language she'd always used with the people she cared about. The door is there. Come back if you need to. Come back just to come back. It doesn't go anywhere. Daniel came back in the summer of her 18th year, not permanently, but for 3 weeks. And he came back different, settled in himself, sure of his path, with the particular confidence of someone who's found where his abilities belong in the world. He was 17 and already being paid as a skilled tradesman, which was not common at 17, and which he accepted with the matter-of-fact appreciation of someone who does good work and expects fair compensation for it. He spent a lot of time in the barn with Henry and a lot of time in the kitchen annoying Ruth. And on the last evening before he went back, he found Eliza on the porch in the late light. "I came back," he said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, with the particular precision of someone who means exactly what he says. "I see that," she said. "I'm going to keep coming back," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him. She thought about the 11-year-old who'd been stealing food even when there was enough and sleeping in the barn at night counting horses in case he needed to run. "I know," she said. "I always knew." He looked at her. "You did not always know," he said. "No," she admitted. "Not always, but for a long time." He sat down on the porch step and looked at the pasture, and she sat beside him, and they were quiet in the way of people who don't need to fill the silence, who have enough history between them that silence is just another room they can be comfortable in. "Do you think about him?" Daniel said. He didn't need to say who. "Every day," she said. "Not always painfully, sometimes just, he's there, part of the way I think about things." He would have liked seeing this, Daniel said. He gestured, at the pasture, the house, the visible evidence of what the place had become. "Yes," she said. He would have. She thought about what Gideon would have said, specifically if he could see it. He wouldn't have said much. That was consistent with him. He'd have looked at the ledgers and the children and the East Wing and the referral network documentation, and he'd have asked 2 or 3 specific questions, and then he'd have said something brief and exactly right. She thought he would have said, "Good," just that. Good. In the flat, complete way he said things that were exactly as large as they needed to be, and no larger. In September of that year, a wagon came down the road toward the ranch at dusk. This happened sometimes, not always planned, not always announced, people who'd heard about the place from someone who'd heard about it from someone else, arriving with the particular combination of desperation and hope that she'd learned to recognize at a distance. She was on the porch when she saw it coming. She stayed on the porch. The wagon carried a woman, maybe 30, maybe older. It was hard to tell because hard years age people in ways that don't map to numbers. And 2 children. A boy of about 7 and a girl of about 5. They had the look she knew. She'd had it once. The particular look of people who've been moving for a long time and are not sure they're allowed to stop. The woman pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate. She looked at Eliza with the careful assessment of someone who'd been disappointed before by things that looked like safety. "Is this the Mercer Ranch?" she said. "Yes," Eliza said. "I heard—" The woman stopped. She seemed to be deciding how much to say, or maybe how to say it. "I heard there might be room." Eliza looked at the woman and her children. She looked at the girl, who was watching her from the wagon seat with the large, watchful eyes of a child, trying to figure out what kind of place this was before she committed to it. She remembered being that child. She remembered the watching. "There's room," she said. She came down the porch steps. "My name is Eliza Hale. I run this ranch." She said it plainly, without qualification, because she'd stopped qualifying it. "Come inside. You can leave the horses where they are. Someone will see to them." The woman looked at her for a moment. This young woman of 18 who was apparently the person in charge of this place, revising whatever she'd expected. "I'm Martha," the woman said. "These are my children." "Welcome, Martha," Eliza said. She looked at the boy and the girl. "What are your names?" The girl who'd been watching her this whole time said, "Lucy." "Lucy," Eliza said. She said it the way you say a name when you're not going to forget it. "All right, Lucy, come on inside. Ruth's made supper and there's more than enough." Lucy looked at her for another moment with those watchful eyes. Then she climbed down from the wagon without waiting to be helped, which Eliza recognized as a specific kind of trust. Not the trusting everything kind, which would have been naive, but the "I'll find out for myself" kind, which was the only kind worth having. Eliza walked her to the door. She thought about what her life had looked like from the outside. If you could see it whole. A girl abandoned in a blizzard. A man who chose not to ride past. An 11-year-old running accounts. A 12-year-old speaking at a town meeting. A 15-year-old who inherited everything before she was ready and did the work anyway. An 18-year-old with her name on a deed and a referral network and a kitchen full of children who'd grown up knowing that home was not a gift that could be taken back. It didn't look like anything simple from the outside. It looked from the inside like a series of days, each one requiring something specific of her, most of them difficult in one way or another. Some of them containing moments of such precise happiness that she'd learned to hold them carefully, the way you hold something that can't be replaced. The thing she'd come to understand, not as a lesson someone taught her, but as something she'd arrived at through the accumulation of all those specific days, was that the story people told about her was not exactly wrong, but was not exactly right either. They said she'd been saved and then she'd saved others, which was neat and symmetrical and satisfying in the way that stories are satisfying when they resolve into a pattern. What she knew from the inside was different. What she knew was that the saving, as people called it, was not a single event in either direction. It was a practice. It was the practice of choosing every day to keep the door open and the lamp burning and the ledgers honest and the food sufficient, and to get up when you'd been knocked down, not because it made you noble, but because there were people who needed the person you were trying to become. Gideon had done that for her. She did it for the people in this house. Some of them were starting to do it for others, in their own ways, in the lives they were building beyond the ranch gate. Daniel, with his machinist's hands, building things that worked. Henry with his cattle operation and the particular steady reliability that the valley had come to count on. Clara, who'd started corresponding with a woman in Billings who was trying to set up something like what the Mercer Ranch was, writing her detailed practical letters about what worked and what didn't. You couldn't trace it all. It went too many directions, got too dispersed, became too much its own thing in each person's hands. That was right. That was what it was supposed to do. The supper that night was what supper at the Mercer Ranch always was. Loud and imperfect and slightly chaotic, with the specific crosstalk of many people who know each other well enough to talk over each other, and the particular noise of children at various ages doing what children do, which is assert their existence at volume. Martha sat at the table with the expression of someone who hasn't eaten a real meal in a while and is trying not to show how much it matters. Her son ate with the focused determination of a hungry child. Lucy sat next to Willa, who had decided within about 4 minutes that Lucy was her new specific project and was explaining things to her with great thoroughness. Eliza sat at the end of the table, Gideon's end, which had been her end for 3 years now, and watched it. She thought, he would have seen this. He would have sat here and watched this, and it would have been enough. She thought, it is enough. Not because everything was resolved into tidiness, or because the hard things had been made easy, or because the people in this room didn't have damage that would stay with them in some form for the rest of their lives. Those things were true, and she didn't wish them untrue, because wishing things were other than they were was the first step toward not seeing them clearly. It was enough because it was real, because the food on the table was real, and the people eating it were real, and the work that had produced both of those things was real, and the door was real, and the door was open, and it was going to stay open. She picked up her fork. Around her, the ranch made its evening sounds, and the light came through the windows at the long September angle, and outside the valley held its breath the way it always did at the end of the day before releasing into full dark. And all of it, the noise and the light and the particular complicated life of this place, went on, as it had always gone on, with the stubborn, unheroic, absolutely necessary insistence of things that have decided to continue.